The Duchess Who Never Was. Eleanor Vance stood in her husband's office that spring morning, hands steady as she laid 4 years of ledgers across his desk. Duke Adrian Hale stared at numbers he'd never seen, profits he didn't earn, repairs he never ordered, threats he never knew existed. His mistress's perfume still clung to his collar. Eleanor's voice cut through the silence. Sign here or lose everything by noon. Outside, a rival lord's carriage already approached the gates, armed with stolen plans and legal documents. But Adrian didn't know the most dangerous part yet. That every word, every strategy he'd whispered to his lover in bed had been sold to their enemies, and his wife had known for months. If you want to see how a woman took back an empire built on lies, stay until the end. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The office door stood open for the first time in 4 years. Eleanor had chosen this moment carefully. Not during one of Adrian's hunting trips, when he'd be gone for weeks and she could quietly manage the crisis alone, as she always did. Not during the evening, when exhaustion might dull her edge or wine might soften his resistance. She'd chosen morning, clear, cold, unforgiving morning, when the light through the tall windows would illuminate every lie, every failure, every truth he'd been too comfortable to see. She watched him now, standing behind his desk, like a man who'd just discovered the ground beneath his feet was nothing but painted canvas. Duke Adrian Hale, 28th of his line, master of the Thornfield estate, holder of 12,000 acres of frontier land, looked at the ledgers spread before him as if they were written in a foreign language. Because to him, they were. What is this? His voice carried that particular tone of aristocratic confusion. Not quite anger yet, still expecting an explanation that would restore his understanding of the world. Estate operations, Eleanor said. She remained standing near the door, hands folded at her waist, posture perfect. 4 years of invisibility had taught her the power of stillness. Revenue and expenditure for the past 48 months, tenant contracts, repair schedules, crop rotations, water rights negotiations, timber sales, and debt restructuring. Adrian's finger traced down a column of numbers, his brow furrowed. These figures don't match what Henderson reports. Henderson reports what you want to hear, Eleanor said quietly. Those are the real numbers. She watched him process this, saw the moment his pride wrestled with his confusion, and lost. He sat down slowly, still staring at the pages. Outside, she could hear the estate waking up, horses being led from stables, workers gathering near the south fields, the distant rhythm of hammers from the cottages being repaired along the eastern boundary. Repairs he knew nothing about. Why are you showing me this now? He asked. Eleanor had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in the dark hours before dawn, lying beside a man who'd stopped seeing her years ago. She'd imagined his reactions, prepared for his anger, his dismissal, his retreat into the comfortable fiction that he was the architect of Thornfield's success. What she hadn't fully prepared for was this, the smallness of him in this moment. How ordinary he looked, stripped of the authority she'd spent 4 years protecting. Because Lord Garrett Pembroke will arrive in 3 hours with documentation claiming mineral rights to the Northern Valley, she said. His legal team has maps, surveys, and historical precedent. He intends to open copper mines on land that currently supports 43 tenant families and provides 18% of our annual revenue. Adrian's head snapped up. That's impossible. The Northern Valley has been Thornfield land for 6 generations. His documentation says otherwise. Eleanor moved closer to the desk now, her silk morning dress whispering against the floor. He has a surveyor's report from 1782 showing disputed boundaries. He has testimony from 3 elderly residents claiming their grandfathers worked those hills for the Pembroke family. And he has detailed knowledge of our current financial position, our debt structure, our vulnerable points. How could he possibly... Adrian stopped mid-sentence. Something shifted in his expression. Eleanor watched him connect pieces he'd been too distracted to see before. How does he know our financial position? This was the moment, the cliff's edge where truth became irreversible. You told him, Eleanor said, through Catherine Marsh. Every strategy I designed, every weakness I shored up, every move I planned, you discussed it with her in bed, and she sold it to Pembroke for £5,000 and a house in the capital. The color drained from Adrian's face. You can't possibly... I have the bank transfers. I have testimony from her former maid. I have the correspondence. Eleanor's voice remained level, almost gentle. This wasn't about vengeance. It had never been about vengeance. She played you perfectly, Adrian. And through you, she's helped Pembroke position himself to take half our estate. Adrian stood abruptly, the chair scraping against wood. This is absurd. Catherine wouldn't. She has no interest in estate matters. She barely understands. She understood enough to ask you questions, Eleanor interrupted. Casual questions, admiring questions. How did you manage to negotiate such favorable lumber contracts? However did you convince the tenant farmers to accept new lease terms? You're so clever with money, darling. How do you keep everything balanced? She watched him remember, saw each conversation flash across his face like lightning illuminating a landscape he'd never really looked at before. You told her everything, Eleanor continued, because it felt good to be admired for accomplishments you thought were yours. And she listened, took notes, and delivered every word to a man who's been waiting 4 years for Thornfield to show vulnerability. Adrian's hands gripped the edge of the desk. If what you're saying is true, if Pembroke truly has this information, this documentation, then we need to prepare a legal defense. I'll need to meet with our solicitors immediately, review our own land surveys, gather historical— I've already done it. He stopped. What? I've reviewed every land grant going back to 1698. I've interviewed 12 elderly residents who remember boundary markers that no longer exist. I've had our surveyor resurvey the entire Northern Valley using original methodology, and I've documented every discrepancy in Pembroke's evidence. Eleanor gestured to a leather case near the door. It's all there. Maps, testimony, legal precedent, and a countersuit that will not only defeat his claim but expose his surveyor for fraud. Adrian stared at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since their wedding night. You did this? When? Over the past 6 months, since I first learned about Catherine and realized what information you'd shared with her. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out over lands she knew better than anyone alive. I knew Pembroke would come eventually. Men like him always do when they smell weakness, so I prepared. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor turned back to face him, and for just a moment let him see the exhaustion beneath her composure. Would you have believed me? 6 months ago, if I'd come to you with suspicions about your mistress selling secrets to a rival lord, would you have listened? Or would you have dismissed me as a jealous wife inventing drama? His silence was answer enough. I've been managing this estate for 4 years, Adrian. Eleanor's voice finally carried an edge now, sharp and cold. Every successful negotiation you've taken credit for in society, every financial recovery you've casually mentioned at your club, every tenant uprising that mysteriously resolved itself before you even heard about it. That was me. All of it. Me. That's not— I've been involved in— You've been hunting, Eleanor said flatly. You've been gambling. You've been spending weeks at a time in the capital, attending parties, maintaining your mistress, playing at being a duke, while I did the actual work of being one. Adrian's face flushed red. I am the duke. This is my estate, my title, Your disaster, Eleanor finished. When I married you, Thornfield was 6 months from bankruptcy. Your father had gambled away 2/3 of the family fortune. Your tenants were on the verge of revolt. Your staff hadn't been paid in 4 months. You were 23 years old, fresh from university, and you had absolutely no idea how to stop the bleeding. I was learning— You were drowning. Eleanor picked up one of the ledgers, opened it to a marked page. This is from our first month of marriage. You spent £1,800 on new hunting horses while our workers went hungry. You hosted a week-long party for your university friends while tenant roofs collapsed in the rain. You ordered imported wine while I was quietly selling my mother's jewelry to pay the staff. She set the ledger down carefully. So I made a choice. I could watch Thornfield collapse and take me down with it, or I could learn how to save it myself. I chose survival. Why didn't you just tell me? Why work in secret all these years? Eleanor almost laughed. I tried, Adrian. Do you remember our 2nd month of marriage? I brought you a list of urgent repairs that needed funding. You patted my hand and told me not to worry about estate business. You said I should focus on planning dinner parties and redecorating the drawing room. I was trying to spare you the burden. You were trying to keep me out, Eleanor said, because in your world, a wife's intelligence is decorative at best, threatening at worst. So I learned to work around you. I forged your signature on contracts. Don't look so shocked. You never read them anyway. I negotiated with tenants and merchants and solicitors, always making sure credit went to you. I restructured our debt, reopened closed mines, implemented new farming techniques, and built relationships with every person of influence within 50 miles. And I did it all invisibly, because that was the only way you'd allow it to happen. Adrian sank back into his chair. You had no right. I had every right. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Eleanor took a breath, steadied herself. This estate is as much mine as yours. My name might not be on the title, but my work is in every acre of it. My decisions kept food on our table and roofs over our workers' heads. My strategies turned us from desperate to profitable, and my silence protected your pride while you played at importance. Then why tell me now? Why destroy the arrangement that's worked for 4 years? Because it's not working anymore. Eleanor moved closer to the desk again, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. Pembroke isn't just coming for the Northern Valley, Adrian. He's coming for everything. He has documentation on our debt structure, our cash reserves, our vulnerable contracts. He knows which tenants are unhappy, which suppliers might be turned, which of our neighbors might be convinced to support his claim. And he knows all of this because you gave it to him, piece by piece, every time you whispered estate secrets to a woman who was mining you for information. She watched this truth settle over him like ash. If I continue operating in the shadows, if I keep hiding my authority and letting you take credit, then when Pembroke's legal team arrives, they'll be facing you. A man who doesn't know the real state of his own estate. A man who can't answer detailed questions about operations, finances, or strategy. A man who will be exposed as a figurehead in front of solicitors, magistrates, and every neighboring lord who shows up to watch the spectacle. Eleanor placed both hands flat on the desk, leaning forward. But if I step into the light now, if I claim my authority publicly, then Pembroke faces someone who actually knows every boundary stone, every contract clause, every legal precedent. Someone who's been preparing for this fight for 6 months. Someone who can beat him. You're asking me to humiliate myself, Adrian said quietly. To admit in front of everyone that my wife has been running things while you what? Lived your life? Enjoyed your privileges? Eleanor straightened. I'm not asking you to humiliate yourself, Adrian. I'm offering you a choice. Stand with me and we might save this estate together, or protect your pride and watch Pembroke take it apart. A knock at the door interrupted them. Henderson, the estate manager, stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable. Your Grace, Lord Pembroke's carriage has been spotted on the North Road. He's arrived earlier than expected. Eleanor saw Adrian's hands tremble slightly as he gripped the desk. This was it, the moment of choice. Tell Lord Pembroke we'll receive him in the formal drawing room in 20 minutes, Eleanor said, her voice carrying an authority Henderson had heard many times before, though never publicly acknowledged. Have Mrs. Chen prepare tea, and gather the full household staff in the main hall. I have an announcement to make. Henderson's eyes flicked to Adrian, waiting for confirmation. The Duke sat frozen, caught between the world he'd known and the one being born in front of him. Henderson, Eleanor said softly, this isn't a request. The estate manager nodded slowly and withdrew. Eleanor turned back to Adrian. In 20 minutes, I'm going to walk into that drawing room and face Pembroke as the acting authority of this estate. Every word I speak will carry the weight of Thornfield behind it. And when he tries to dismiss me, and he will, I need you to either support my authority or undermine it. There's no middle ground anymore. The door is open, Adrian. It won't close again. She moved toward the door, then paused. 4 years ago, you married me because your family needed money, and mine had it. You barely spoke to me during our engagement. You looked disappointed when you lifted my veil at the wedding. And on our wedding night, you were so drunk you fell asleep before even removing your coat. Adrian flinched at the memory. I tell you this, Eleanor continued, not to wound you, but to remind you that I never expected love from this marriage. I expected partnership, respect, a shared purpose. Instead, I got a stranger who was content to let me be invisible as long as his comfort remained intact. Well, I'm done being invisible, and I'm done protecting your comfort at the expense of everything we've built. She opened the door fully, letting sunlight flood the previously dim office. Pembroke will be here in 15 minutes, she said. Use that time to decide who you want to be when he arrives. Then Eleanor Vance walked out, leaving her husband alone with the truth. The main hall filled quickly. Word spread through Thornfield like wildfire. The Duchess has called an assembly. Workers came in from the fields, still dusty from morning labor. Kitchen staff emerged with flour on their aprons. Stable hands, gardeners, tenant representatives who happened to be on the grounds. all of them gathered in the vaulted space that had once hosted grand balls but now served mostly as a passage between wings. Eleanor stood at the top of the main staircase, looking down at faces she'd come to know intimately over 4 years. There was Thomas, the head carpenter, whose daughter she'd helped enroll in a school in the nearest town. Margaret from the Kitchens, whose son's medical bills Eleanor had quietly covered. James, the tenant representative from the Eastern Farms, who'd wept when she'd restructured his family's lease to actually be survivable. They looked up at her with something she'd rarely seen directed her way in public: recognition. "Most of you know me as the Duke's wife," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Some of you know me as the woman who occasionally visits the tenant cottages or reviews the household accounts. But very few of you know the full truth of what I've been doing these past 4 years." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor saw Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, watching with knowing eyes. She'd been Eleanor's quiet ally from the beginning, one of the few who'd understood what was really happening. "I have been managing every aspect of Thornfield's operations," Eleanor continued. "Every repair, every contract, every negotiation, every decision that kept this estate running and profitable. I did this work in secret, allowing the Duke to receive credit, because that was the only way society would allow it to function." The murmuring grew louder. She saw shock on some faces, resignation on others, and on a few, like Thomas and Margaret, something that looked almost like relief. But today that changes. Lord Garrett Pembroke has arrived with legal claims to seize the Northern Valley. He believes Thornfield is weak, vulnerable, poorly managed. He expects to negotiate with a duke who doesn't understand his own estate's operations. Instead, he's going to face me. Eleanor descended 3 steps, coming closer to the assembly. "I'm telling you this now because what happens in the next few hours will determine Thornfield's future. If we win, it will be because we stand together, with full knowledge of who has been leading us. If we lose, you deserve to know why, and who failed you." "What do you need from us, Your Grace?" Thomas called out. Several others nodded. "The truth," Eleanor said simply. "When Pembroke's people start asking questions, trying to find weakness or contradiction, tell them the truth. Tell them who negotiated your leases, who approved the repairs, who restructured the debt. Tell them who actually runs this estate." She looked across the sea of faces. "I won't pretend this isn't complicated. I won't pretend society will approve, but I'm done pretending I don't exist." A sound made Eleanor turn. Adrian stood in the office doorway, still pale, still processing. Their eyes met across the hall. In his hands, he held the leather case with all her documentation. He descended the stairs slowly, joining her. The assembly watched in absolute silence. "My wife," Adrian said, his voice rough but steady, "has been the true authority of Thornfield for 4 years. I was too proud, too foolish, and too comfortable to see it. Or perhaps I saw it and chose to ignore it because acknowledging her competence meant confronting my own inadequacy." Eleanor heard several sharp intakes of breath. This was not how dukes spoke, especially not in front of staff. "When Lord Pembroke arrives," Adrian continued, "he will be met by the person who actually knows this estate. I will stand with her, support her authority, and answer for my failures. What I will not do is pretend any more that I've been steering this ship when I've barely been on deck." He turned to Eleanor and she saw something new in his expression. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of respect. "I can't undo 4 years of blindness in 4 minutes, but I can choose to see clearly from this moment forward." He held out the leather case. "These are yours. This fight is yours. I'm here to support you, not lead you." Eleanor took the case, feeling its weight. Around them, the assembly remained frozen, watching a marriage transform in real time. "Lord Pembroke's carriage is approaching the main entrance," Henderson announced from near the front doors. Eleanor looked at her husband. "Can you stand beside me and let me speak without interference? Can you defer to my knowledge without resentment?" "I don't know," Adrian said honestly. "My pride is arguing against it even now, but I'm going to try." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a full apology. But it was perhaps the first completely honest thing he'd said to her in 4 years. "Then let's go meet our enemy," Eleanor said. They walked together toward the formal drawing room, the assembly parting to let them pass. Behind them, Eleanor heard whispers starting, saw staff members exchanging glances. The story would spread beyond Thornfield's walls within hours. By tomorrow, every estate within 100 miles would know that the Duchess Vance had stepped out of the shadows. There was no going back now. The formal drawing room had been prepared hastily but well. Tea service gleamed on the sideboard. Fresh flowers, probably grabbed from whatever was in season, sat in crystal vases. The furniture had been arranged to create a clear sense of authority. 2 chairs positioned at the head of the room, others arranged in a subordinate arc. Eleanor stood near the window, watching Pembroke's carriage roll to a stop. She recognized his crest, a hawk clutching a branch. Appropriate for a man who preyed on weakness. "He's brought a lot of people," Adrian observed, standing beside her. Indeed, Pembroke emerged with an entourage. 2 solicitors carrying document cases, a surveyor with maps, and 3 men who looked like hired muscle dressed up in formal clothing. He clearly expected resistance. What he didn't expect, Eleanor thought, was competence. Pembroke entered the room like a man arriving at his own victory party. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the kind of confident smile that came from winning too many battles. His eyes swept the room, dismissed the staff members present, settled on Adrian, flicked briefly across Eleanor, then returned to the Duke. "Adrian," he said warmly, as if they were old friends, "so good of you to receive me on such short notice." "Lord Pembroke," Adrian replied, his voice carefully neutral. Pembroke's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and she saw the calculation there. "And the lovely Duchess. I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," Eleanor said. She didn't curtsy, didn't smile, didn't perform any of the social niceties expected of duchesses. "But you know enough about me, I think. Or at least, you believe you do." Something flickered across Pembroke's face, the first hint that this might not go as smoothly as he'd planned. "Shall we sit?" Eleanor gestured to the arranged chairs. "I understand you have business to discuss." Pembroke's solicitors exchanged glances. Usually, at this point, the Duchess would excuse herself and leave the men to their discussions. Eleanor settled into her chair instead, Adrian taking the one beside her, and waited. Pembroke recovered quickly, his smile never wavering as he sat. "I'll get straight to the point, then. I've come across some interesting historical documentation regarding the Northern Valley, specifically evidence that the boundary between Thornfield and Pembroke lands has been incorrectly marked for several generations." He nodded to one of his solicitors, who produced a map. "This is a surveyor's report from 1782. As you can see, it clearly shows the watershed divide as the true boundary, which would place the entire Northern Valley, including the mineral-rich hills, on Pembroke land." The map was spread across the table. Eleanor leaned forward, studied it for precisely 5 seconds, then sat back. "That's a copy of the Hendricks Survey. The original is held in the county records office. I examined it last month." Pembroke's smile tightened fractionally. "Then you'll know it's quite definitive." "I know it's been selectively edited," Eleanor said calmly. "The original shows the watershed divide as one proposed boundary. It also shows 2 other proposed boundaries, both of which place the Northern Valley firmly within Thornfield territory. Your copy only includes the one that favors your interpretation." She gestured to Henderson, who'd positioned himself near the door. He brought forward Eleanor's leather case. She extracted her own map and laid it beside Pembroke's. "This is a complete copy showing all 3 proposed boundaries. You'll notice the surveyor's own notes recommend the eastern ridgeline as the most accurate, which is the one that's been used for the past 140 years. Pembroke's lead solicitor leaned forward. "With respect, Your Grace, this is a rather complex legal matter. Perhaps we should speak directly with the Duke's legal counsel." "I am the legal counsel," Eleanor interrupted pleasantly. "Well, I'm not a solicitor, obviously, but I've spent 6 months researching this exact issue with our attorneys. Every document you've brought today I've already reviewed and prepared counters for. Shall we continue?" The solicitor looked at Pembroke, who'd stopped smiling entirely. "You have testimony from elderly residents," Eleanor continued, not waiting for them to regroup. 3 of them, I believe, claiming their grandfathers worked the Northern Hills for the Pembroke family." "We do," Pembroke said carefully. "I have testimony from 12 residents, most older than yours, with detailed knowledge of boundary markers that existed before the 1782 survey." Eleanor produced a bound document. "I also have employment records from 1790 to 1830, showing that the 3 families your witnesses belonged to were actually Thornfield tenants who worked both valley land and hill land. They worked on Pembroke land occasionally, but they lived and paid rent to Thornfield." She slid the document across to Pembroke's solicitors. "The confusion is understandable. The families moved between valleys for seasonal work, but their legal residence and primary allegiance was always to Thornfield." One of the solicitors began flipping through the document, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "As for mineral rights," Eleanor continued, "you're correct that copper was discovered in the Northern Hills approximately 60 years ago. A small mining operation was established. What your research apparently missed is that this mine was opened under a joint venture between the Thornfield and Pembroke families. The original contract, which I have here, specifies that mineral rights remain with the surface landowner, while both families share profits from any extraction. The mine closed in 1808 when the main vein ran dry, but the contract never expired. Bausi ipulstotad. She produced another document, which means even if your boundary claim were successful, which it isn't, you still wouldn't have exclusive mineral rights. We'd own them jointly. The room had gone very quiet. Pembroke's surveyor was pale, staring at the maps as if they'd personally betrayed him. The solicitors were reading Eleanor's documentation with increasing discomfort. The muscle men shifted awkwardly, realizing there was no physical intimidation that could salvage this situation. Pembroke himself sat very still. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its warmth. "You've been remarkably thorough, Duchess." "I've had excellent motivation," Eleanor replied. "I wonder," Pembroke said slowly, "how a duke's wife acquired such detailed knowledge of legal history, boundary disputes, and contract law. It's quite unusual." The implication was clear. He was questioning her right to even be in this conversation. Adrian, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "My wife acquired this knowledge by doing the work I should have been doing for the past 4 years. While I was distracted by lesser matters, she was protecting our estate from threats I didn't even see coming." He looked directly at Pembroke, "including threats fed by my own carelessness." Pembroke's expression shifted subtly. He understood now. This wasn't just about a land dispute. This was about information warfare, and he'd just discovered his intelligence source had been compromised. "Catherine Marsh sends her regards, by the way," Eleanor said quietly. "Or she would, if she hadn't fled to the continent 3 days ago with your advance payment. I believe she's in France now. Lovely this time of year." Pembroke's hands clenched on the armrests of his chair. "You've been tracking everything," Eleanor finished. "From the moment I discovered my husband was sharing sensitive information with a woman whose banking records showed regular large deposits from an unknown source. It took time to trace it back to you, but I had time. You were patient in building your case, and I was patient in dismantling it." She stood, gathering her documents. "So here's where we stand, Lord Pembroke. Your boundary claim is false, and I can prove it in any court. Your witness testimony is compromised, and I have better witnesses. Your surveyor's work contains deliberate errors that I've documented in detail. And your intelligence on Thornfield's vulnerability was 4 months out of date before you even received it." Eleanor moved to stand directly in front of Pembroke's chair. "You came here expecting to negotiate with a distracted duke and walk away with half an estate. Instead, you're facing someone who's been preparing for this exact confrontation for half a year. So I'll offer you the same choice I gave my husband this morning. Accept reality or fight it and lose everything." "What reality?" Pembroke asked tightly. "That Thornfield is stronger than you thought, better defended than you planned for, and run by someone you completely underestimated." Eleanor's voice remained perfectly calm. "Withdraw your claim, publicly, today. And I'll be generous. I won't pursue fraud charges against your surveyor, I won't countersue for legal costs, and I won't make a formal complaint to the magistrate about your use of stolen intelligence. And if I refuse?" Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I'll do all of those things, plus one more. I'll make sure every lord within 200 miles knows exactly how you built your case. I'll detail how you seduced information out of a lonely duke through his mistress, how you paid for that information, and how thoroughly you were defeated by a woman working from a country estate office. Your reputation will be demolished, not because you lost, but because of how spectacularly incompetent your loss was." Pembroke stood slowly. For a moment, Eleanor wondered if he'd actually become violent. The muscle men tensed, and she saw Adrian shift in her peripheral vision, but Pembroke simply straightened his coat and picked up his hat. "You've made an enemy today, Duchess," he said quietly. "No," Eleanor corrected. "I defeated an enemy today. There's a difference." Pembroke looked at Adrian. "You're a fool, letting your wife humiliate me like this. It makes you look weak." "Perhaps," Adrian said. "But I'd rather look weak beside my competent wife than strong while losing my estate to your legal theft. Pride is expensive, Pembroke. I'm learning I can't afford it anymore." Pembroke's jaw worked, but he had nothing left to say. He turned to his team. "We're leaving." The solicitors scrambled to gather documents. The surveyor looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. They filed out of the drawing room in defeated silence. Eleanor watched from the window as Pembroke's carriage rolled away, much faster than it had arrived. The hawk on his crest caught the afternoon light, still clutching its branch, but the hawk was leaving empty-handed. "Is it really over?" Adrian asked behind her. "This part is." Eleanor turned from the window. "He'll spread poison about me in society. Call me unnatural, ambitious, controlling. Say I've bewitched you or manipulated you. Some people will believe him. And the others will see that I won." Eleanor set her documents aside. "In the end, competence speaks louder than scandal. We've held Thornfield. The Northern Valley is safe. Our tenants' homes are secure. That matters more than drawing room gossip." Adrian moved to stand beside her at the window. "I have so many questions about how you learned all of this, when you did it, who helped you." "I know," Eleanor said, "and I'll answer them, all of them, but not right now." She felt suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline of the confrontation was draining away, leaving behind the weight of 4 years of secrecy, months of investigation, and this morning's irreversible choice to step into the light. "Right now," she continued, "I need to speak with the staff. They witnessed something extraordinary today, and they need to understand what it means for them. Then I need to send messages to our tenant representatives, our suppliers, our allies. Everyone needs to know that Thornfield's authority structure has changed." "Can I help?" Adrian asked. Eleanor looked at him, studying his face for signs of resentment or wounded pride. She saw exhaustion there, confusion certainly, but also something that might have been genuine offering. "Yes," she said finally. "You can stand beside me while I speak to them. Not in front, not behind. Beside. Can you do that?" "I can try." It was the same answer he'd given earlier. Not a promise of perfection, but an acknowledgement of effort. "Then let's begin," Eleanor said. They walked together back to the main hall where the household staff still waited. Some had gone back to work, but most had stayed, sensing that the morning's drama wasn't quite finished. When Eleanor and Adrian appeared, conversation stopped. "Lord Pembroke has withdrawn his claim," Eleanor announced. "The Northern Valley remains Thornfield land. Everyone's homes and livelihoods are secure." A cheer went up, restrained at first, then building as relief swept through the crowd. Eleanor let it run its course, then raised her hand for quiet. "What happened here today changes things," she continued. "The way this estate operates, the way decisions are made, the way authority is recognized. Some of those changes will be obvious. Others will take time to understand. But I need you all to know this. I'm not hiding anymore. The work I've been doing in secret for 4 years, I'll now be doing in the open. My name will be on contracts. My signature will authorize expenses. My decisions will stand." She paused, letting this settle. "I know this is unusual. I know society doesn't approve. If any of you are uncomfortable serving under a woman's direct authority, I'll understand. You're free to seek other positions without prejudice." The hall was silent. Eleanor waited, wondering if anyone would take the offer. Thomas, the head carpenter, stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but most of us already knew. Maybe not all the details, but we knew someone clever was keeping things running. Knew it wasn't—" He glanced at Adrian, then back to Eleanor. "Well, we knew." Margaret from the kitchens nodded. "You helped my boy when he was sick, paid for medicine I couldn't afford. Never asked for thanks, never mentioned it again. That's leadership, Your Grace. Name on a contract or no name, we've been following you for years." Others murmured agreement. Eleanor felt something catch in her throat. She'd expected respect, maybe even loyalty, but this easy acceptance caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said quietly. "All of you, for your work, your discretion, and your trust." Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, cleared her throat. "If I may, Your Grace, there are practical matters to address. Household accounts, purchasing authority, staff schedules, all the things that were done quietly before will need clear procedures now." "You're right," Eleanor said. "Let's meet this afternoon to establish new protocols. Anyone whose role involves direct reporting or decision-making should attend." The assembly began to disperse, staff members returning to their duties, but with an energy that hadn't been there before. Eleanor heard snatches of excited conversation, saw smiles that looked less strained than usual. Henderson approached as the hall cleared. "That was well done, Your Grace, both of you." Adrian nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing. Eleanor could see him processing everything, watching the staff's easy acceptance of her authority with something like wonder. "Henderson," Eleanor said, "I'll need you to prepare updated documentation, new signing authorities, revised reporting structures. Can you have a draft ready by tomorrow morning? Of course, Your Grace. When they were finally alone in the hall, Adrian sank onto the bottom step of the main staircase. They knew. All this time, they knew you were the real authority. Most of them, yes. Eleanor sat beside him, feeling the enormity of the morning settling onto her shoulders. The ones who worked closely with estate operations, the ones whose problems I solved directly. They're not stupid, Adrian. They could see who was actually making things work. And they just went along with the fiction? Let me take credit? Because it kept things stable, Eleanor said. Because openly challenging a duke's authority would have meant chaos. Because sometimes survival means accepting comfortable lies. She looked at him. Until those lies become too dangerous to maintain. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. I need to know everything. Every decision, every negotiation, every problem you solved while I was oblivious. I need to understand what I've been blind to. That will take time, Eleanor warned. 4 years of decisions can't be explained in an afternoon. Then we'll take whatever time it needs. He stood, offering her his hand. Starting now. Show me the real Thornfield, the one I've never actually seen. Eleanor took his hand and stood. It won't be comfortable. You'll see failures you didn't prevent, suffering you didn't notice, problems you should have solved but didn't. I know, Adrian said, but I can't fix my blindness by refusing to see. They walked together toward Eleanor's private office, the small room off the library where she'd actually done all her work, where the real ledgers lived, where 4 years of quiet crisis management had unfolded in secret. The door stood open. The afternoon light fell across desks covered in papers, maps, correspondence, and all the invisible architecture of an estate most people never saw. This was the real heart of Thornfield. Not the grand public rooms, but this cluttered space where decisions were made and futures were shaped. This is where I've spent most of my time, Eleanor said. While you were in your father's office, playing the role of Duke, I was here, actually being one. Adrian stepped inside, looking around with the expression of a man discovering a hidden world that had been operating parallel to his own. I never even knew this room existed. You never asked what I did with my days, Eleanor said simply, and I stopped trying to tell you. She moved to her desk, picked up the current ledger. This is where we actually stand financially. Not the simplified version Henderson gives you, but the real numbers. We're profitable now, but it's precarious. One bad harvest, one major repair, one legal battle like this morning, and we could slide backward quickly. Adrian took the ledger, began reading. His finger traced down columns, and Eleanor saw him start to understand the complexity he'd been sheltered from. The intricate balancing of debt service, operational costs, investment in improvements, emergency reserves. None of it was simple. None of it could be managed casually. How did you learn all this? He asked. Books, at first. Your father's old records, though they were largely useless. More fiction than fact. Then I started talking to people. Our solicitor, our banker, tenant representatives, other estate managers in the region. I asked questions, lots of questions, and I paid attention. Eleanor moved to the window. Also, I had motivation. Survival is a powerful teacher. I should have been the one learning this, Adrian said quietly. Yes, Eleanor agreed. You should have, but you weren't, so I did. He looked up from the ledger. Can you teach me now? Not to replace you. I understand that ship has sailed, but so I can actually be useful, so I can be a real partner instead of decorative authority. Eleanor studied him, trying to gauge if this was genuine or just wounded pride seeking redemption. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy. You'll have to admit ignorance, ask basic questions, accept correction from your wife in front of staff and tenants. I know. And even then, Eleanor continued, I'll still be the primary authority, because I've earned that position, and I won't give it up just to spare your ego. I know that too. Eleanor considered. 4 hours ago, she would have said this was impossible, that Adrian was too proud, too comfortable, too convinced of his own importance to ever genuinely submit to learning from her. But then again, 4 hours ago she hadn't yet forced him to see the truth. Maybe people could change. Maybe crisis could crack open space for growth. Or maybe he'd try for a week and then retreat back into comfortable incompetence. Only time would tell. All right, Eleanor said finally. We'll start tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, dress for riding. We'll tour the estate, all of it, and I'll show you what's actually happening on the land you claim to own. Adrian nodded. 6 o'clock. He set down the ledger carefully and turned to leave, then paused at the door. Eleanor, thank you for saving us, even while I made it as difficult as possible. She didn't respond immediately. Gratitude was complicated when it came 4 years late. Don't thank me yet, she said finally. Thank me when you've actually learned something. When you can have an intelligent conversation with our tenants about crop rotation. When you can explain our debt structure to the bank. When you've earned the right to stand beside me as an equal instead of just claiming it by title. Fair enough, Adrian said, and left. Eleanor stood alone in her office as afternoon faded toward evening. Through the window, she could see Thornfield's land stretching away toward the horizon. Fields and forests, cottages and workshops. The whole complex machinery of lives and livelihoods she'd been protecting in secret for so long. Tomorrow, she'd begin protecting them in the light. The door remained open, and somewhere out there past the boundaries of Thornfield, Garrett Pembroke was nursing his defeat and planning his revenge. Society would soon hear about the Duchess who'd stepped beyond her place. There would be consequences, social, political, personal. But Eleanor had spent 4 years learning that survival required more than playing by rules designed to keep you powerless. Sometimes it required breaking them completely. She closed the ledger, tidied her desk, and prepared for whatever came next. The sun set over Thornfield, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. The estate settled into evening routines, dinner preparations, animals bedded down, workers heading home to their cottages. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed. In the drawing room where Pembroke had been defeated, Mrs. Chen supervised the staff cleaning up. In the main hall, Henderson made notes about new procedures. In the stables, Thomas whistled while he worked, knowing the Northern Valley was safe. And in the private office off the library, Eleanor Vance, Duchess of Thornfield, sat in the gathering dusk and allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction. She had won, not through violence or manipulation or the traditional tools men use to claim power, but through knowledge, preparation, and the courage to finally stop hiding. The door stood open. The truth was out. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. 6 o'clock came too early. Eleanor had been awake since 4, unable to sleep past the habits 4 years had carved into her body. She dressed in riding clothes, practical ones, not the decorative side-saddle outfit society expected, and waited in the stables, wondering if Adrian would actually show. He did. 10 minutes late, looking like he'd barely slept, but he came. "Good morning," he said, voice still rough from sleep. Eleanor handed him a cup of coffee from the thermos she'd brought. "We're starting at the Eastern Tenant Farms. The families there have been with Thornfield longest, and they're facing the worst conditions." "Worst how?" "You'll see." They rode out as dawn broke across the estate, horses' breath steaming in the cool morning air. Eleanor set a brisk pace, and Adrian struggled to keep up. More evidence of how little time he'd actually spent on horseback doing anything useful. His hunting rides were leisurely affairs with long breaks for drinking. This was work. The eastern farms appeared gradually through morning mist. Small cottages clustered around larger working buildings, fields stretching beyond them in neat rows. At first glance, everything looked pastoral and well-maintained. Adrian seemed ready to relax, to assume his wife had exaggerated the problems. Then Eleanor led him closer. The first cottage they approached had a roof patched with mismatched materials. Old thatch, pieces of wood, what looked like canvas tarp weighted down with stones. A woman was drawing water from a well, her movements careful and slow, favoring her left side. "Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor called out, dismounting. "How's your back?" The woman looked up, surprise crossing her face when she saw the Duke. "Oh, Your Grace, both of you. I didn't expect— My back's managing, ma'am. Thank you for asking. This is Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor said to Adrian, who was dismounting awkwardly. Her husband died 3 years ago in a farming accident. She's been working their lease alone since then with help from her 2 sons when they're not hired out to neighbors. Adrian nodded politely, clearly unsure what he was supposed to say. "Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor continued, "would you show the Duke your cottage roof, the section that collapsed last winter?" The woman's face tightened. "Your Grace, I don't want to complain. You've already done so much, getting the support beams replaced." "I know, but the Duke needs to see the full situation. Please." Mrs. Patterson led them around to the back of the cottage. Part of the roof had clearly collapsed at some point and been hastily rebuilt. The repair was functional but crude, and Eleanor could see daylight through gaps in the thatching. "It happened during that heavy snow," Mrs. Patterson explained, addressing Eleanor. "The weight was too much for the old beams. My boys and I tried to shore it up, but we don't have the skills or materials for proper repairs. And you reported this to Henderson? Eleanor prompted, knowing the answer. Yes, ma'am. He said he'd send someone when they had time. Eleanor turned to Adrian. That was 4 months ago. Henderson filed the request under non-urgent because Mrs. Patterson is a widow without a husband to advocate for her. It's been sitting in a pile of similar requests ever since. Adrian's face reddened. Henderson shouldn't have... Henderson does what he's always done, Eleanor said quietly. He prioritizes based on who has the most social weight to complain. Widows, elderly tenants, families with no connections, they go to the bottom of the list. She gestured to the cottage. This is one of 12 similar situations on the eastern farms alone. Roofs that leak, wells that run dry in summer, fences that don't keep out livestock. Small problems that become big ones when they're ignored for months. And they're ignored because the people suffering them don't have loud enough voices. Mrs. Patterson stood awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable being used as an object lesson. Eleanor touched her arm gently. I promise someone will be here this week to properly repair your roof. The Duke is going to personally insure it. I am? Adrian asked, then caught Eleanor's look. I am, yes, this week. After they left Mrs. Patterson's cottage, riding toward the next farm, Adrian was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, Why didn't you just fix it yourself? You clearly have the authority to order repairs. I did fix some of them, Eleanor replied. The worst ones, the ones that couldn't wait. But there are limits to what I could do secretly. Every repair I authorized had to be justified in ways that wouldn't make Henderson suspicious about who was really making decisions. And even then, I had to be strategic. Too many repairs too quickly would have drawn attention. So people suffered because you had to maintain a fiction. Yes. Eleanor's voice was flat. That's what I've been trying to make you understand. Secrecy has costs. Every day I worked in the shadows was a day I couldn't fully help people who needed it. They visited 6 more farms that morning. Each one revealed similar patterns: neglected repairs, postponed improvements, small injustices that had compounded over time. By the 3rd stop, Adrian had stopped looking defensive and started looking ill. At the last farm, an elderly man named Mr. Donnelly showed them a fence that separated his grazing land from a neighbor's. The fence had been damaged months ago when the neighbor's bull broke through, and both families had been arguing ever since about who should pay for repairs. The problem, Eleanor explained, is that the fence sits on a boundary that was never properly surveyed. The original estate maps are vague about this section, so neither family wants to pay for something that might not even be on their land. Can't we just have it surveyed? Adrian asked. We could. It would cost about £40 and take 2 weeks, but Henderson says it's not worth the expense for tenant squabbles. Eleanor's tone made clear what she thought of that assessment. Meanwhile, Mr. Donnelly's sheep keep wandering onto the neighbor's land. The neighbor threatens to shoot them, and both families are one incident away from serious conflict. So survey it, Adrian said. £40 is nothing compared to the cost of a real dispute. Eleanor smiled slightly. That's the first sensible thing you've said all morning. Welcome to estate management. It's mostly about preventing problems before they explode. By the time they returned to the main house for lunch, Adrian looked exhausted. He dismounted heavily, wincing as his legs protested the unfamiliar exercise. How often do you do this? 3 times a week, more during planting or harvest season. For 4 years? For 4 years. Adrian was quiet through lunch, picking at his food while Eleanor reviewed the afternoon schedule with Mrs. Chen. When the housekeeper left, he finally spoke. I understand now why people knew you were the real authority. Anyone actually paying attention would see it. Yes. And I never paid attention. No. He set down his fork. I don't know how to apologize for that. I don't think there are words big enough. Then don't apologize, Eleanor said. Just learn. Actually see what needs to be done and help me do it. A knock interrupted them. Henderson entered, looking agitated. Your Grace, there's been an incident in town. The magistrate's office sent word. Eleanor stood immediately. What kind of incident? Some of Lord Pembroke's men were seen at the Three Bells Tavern last night, buying drinks and telling stories. About yesterday. About the Duchess. Henderson looked uncomfortable. Apparently they're claiming you seduced secrets from the Duke, used feminine manipulation to undermine his authority, that sort of thing. Of course they are, Eleanor said calmly, though her hands clenched briefly. Pembroke needs to salvage his reputation somehow. Blaming a manipulative woman is easier than admitting he was outmaneuvered. It's worse than that, Henderson continued. They're specifically targeting our tenant relationships, suggesting that any contracts signed by you aren't legally valid since you're not the titled holder. Some of the farmers in town are worried their leases might be challenged. Adrian stood. That's absurd. The leases are valid regardless of who signed them. I can confirm that. Can you? Eleanor asked quietly. Because according to the law, I have no independent legal authority. Everything I do is technically under your authority as my husband. If someone wants to challenge contracts I signed, they could argue I exceeded my legal powers. But you've been managing the estate for years. Without explicit written authorization from you, Eleanor interrupted, which means every contract, every agreement, every decision I made could theoretically be challenged as unauthorized. She turned to Henderson. How widespread is this talk? It's just starting, Your Grace. But Lord Pembroke's men are being strategic about it. They're not making direct accusations, just raising questions, planting doubts. Eleanor moved to the window, thinking. This was exactly what she'd expected. Pembroke couldn't win legally, so he was attacking her legitimacy through social channels. And he'd found a real vulnerability. Every decision she'd made in secret could now be questioned publicly. We need to make it official, Adrian said behind her. Legal documents, explicit authorization, something that retroactively validates everything you've done. That won't help, Eleanor said. Retroactive authorization looks desperate, like we're scrambling to cover mistakes. It would actually make the doubts worse. Then what do we do? Eleanor turned from the window, decision crystallizing in her mind. We go forward, not backward. We don't try to validate what I did in secret. We make it impossible to question what I do openly. I don't understand. Marriage law gives you all the power, yes, but it also gives you the right to delegate that power however you choose. Eleanor moved back to the table, her mind working quickly. You can issue a formal proclamation granting me full legal authority to act on Thornfield's behalf, not as your agent, but as a co-holder of authority. It would need to be witnessed, registered with the magistrate, made completely official. Henderson looked shocked. Your Grace, I've never heard of such an arrangement. Because it's almost never done, Eleanor agreed. Most men would rather lose their estates than share legal power with their wives, but it's not illegal. Unconventional, yes. Shocking, certainly, but legally sound. Adrian was quiet for a moment. If I do this, if I grant you formal legal authority, it can't be taken back easily. You'd have real power, independent of my approval. I'd be giving up control. Yes, Eleanor said simply. You would. Society would call me weak, dominated by my wife. Other lords would mock me. Yes, they would. I'd be confirming everything Pembroke is saying about you manipulating me. In the short term, yes. Eleanor met his eyes. But in the long term, it would establish beyond doubt that my authority is legitimate, that every decision I make going forward has full legal backing. Pembroke's whisper campaign would have nothing to work with. She could see him struggling with it, pride wrestling with pragmatism. This was different from standing beside her during Pembroke's visit. This was permanent, formal, public surrender of power that society said belonged to him by right. What happens if we don't do this? He asked finally. We fight 100 small battles instead of one big one. Every tenant Pembroke's men speak to, every merchant they plant doubts with, every neighbor they convince to question my authority. We'll spend the next year defending decisions I already made instead of moving forward, and some of those battles we'll lose. Henderson cleared his throat. If I may, Your Grace, there's another consideration. If word spreads that the Duchess's contracts might not be valid, some of our more opportunistic tenants might try to renegotiate terms, claim they're not bound by agreements made without proper authority. Exactly, Eleanor said. We either establish clear, unquestionable authority now, or we deal with chaos for months. Adrian walked to the window, staring out at the estate grounds. Eleanor watched him, wondering which way he'd break. This wasn't about a single confrontation anymore. This was about reshaping the fundamental structure of their marriage and their estate. Permanently. If I do this, Adrian said slowly, I need something from you. Eleanor tensed. Here it came. The negotiation, the attempt to claw back some power, the conditions that would undermine the whole point. I need you to teach me, Adrian continued, surprising her. Really teach me. Not just show me problems or explain decisions after you've made them. Involve me in the process. Let me learn how to actually be useful. That's what you want? Eleanor asked carefully. Education? I want partnership. Real partnership. He turned from the window. If I'm going to give up the fiction of control, I need to develop actual competence. Otherwise, I'm just decorative, a name on documents with no understanding behind it. And I can't live like that. I won't. Eleanor studied him, trying to assess if this was genuine or pride finding a new shape. Partnership means you defer to my knowledge when I have more of it. It means accepting correction publicly when you're wrong. It means sometimes making decisions together and sometimes accepting that I'll make them alone because there isn't time for consensus. I understand. Do you? Because this morning you looked ill just seeing neglected cottages. Wait until you're in a room full of angry tenants demanding things we can't afford, or negotiating with merchants who think they can cheat us, or managing workers who hate each other but have to cooperate. The real work isn't pretty. It's messy and uncomfortable and often thankless. I know, or I'm starting to know. Adrian moved back to the table, but I also know that right now I'm useless. I contribute nothing of value. The best I can do is stay out of your way, and even then I cause damage through ignorance. That's not sustainable for either of us. Eleanor considered this. There was logic in it, even if it complicated things. Teaching Adrian would take time and energy she could be using elsewhere. But having a partner who actually understood the work, who could handle some decisions independently, who could present a united front with real knowledge behind it, that had value too. All right, she said finally. I'll write the authorization document this afternoon. You'll review it, sign it, and we'll have it witnessed and registered by tomorrow morning. In exchange, I'll involve you in daily operations, starting immediately. Immediately? We have a tenants' council meeting tonight, Eleanor said. Representative families from each section of the estate. They gather monthly to discuss problems, negotiate changes, voice complaints. Usually I handle it alone because She paused delicately. Because I'm hunting or gambling or otherwise occupied, Adrian finished. What happens at these meetings? Democracy, Eleanor said bluntly. We're close to it. They tell me what's not working, I explain what's possible, and we find solutions together. Sometimes it's calm and productive. Sometimes people yell. Sometimes I have to make decisions they hate and enforce them anyway. And you want me there for tonight's meeting? I want you to see how this actually works. How authority functions when you can't just command obedience. These people could leave. They're not slaves. They're tenants with contracts that allow termination. If we fail them too badly, they'll go work for someone else, and we'll lose the labor that keeps Thornfield functioning. Henderson, still present, looked nervous. Your Grace, perhaps the Duke should observe a few meetings before participating. No, Adrian interrupted. If I'm going to learn, I need to start now, before I can build comfortable assumptions about how things work. Eleanor nodded approvingly. The meeting starts at 7 in the main barn. Don't dress formally. These are working people, and they'll be coming straight from their jobs. And for the love of everything, don't try to dominate the conversation. Listen more than you speak. I can do that. We'll see. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor drafted the authorization document with help from their solicitor, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized what she was creating. The language had to be precise, broad enough to grant real authority, specific enough to be legally defensible. By the time she'd finished the third revision, her hand ached from writing and her eyes burned from reviewing law texts. Adrian spent the afternoon with Henderson, reviewing tenant contracts and current operations. Eleanor checked on them once and found her husband taking notes like a student, asking questions that ranged from insightful to embarrassingly basic. Henderson looked torn between respect for Adrian's effort and dismay at how much the Duke didn't know. At 6:30, Eleanor changed into simpler clothes and made her way to the main barn. Workers were already gathering. She recognized faces, knew most of their names and situations. Thomas the carpenter nodded to her. Mrs. Miller from the Western Dairy Farms waved. Young Jacob, who'd recently taken over his father's lease, stood nervously near the back. Adrian arrived a few minutes later, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him in public. The gathering quieted when he entered, people exchanging uncertain glances. Evening, everyone, Eleanor said, stepping forward before the awkwardness could solidify. As you can see, the Duke is joining us tonight. Some of you may have heard about yesterday's events with Lord Pembroke. Things are changing at Thornfield, and we wanted to discuss those changes with you directly. She gestured for Adrian to step forward. He looked nervous but moved to stand beside her, not in front. Small detail, but people noticed. Most of you know I've had limited involvement with daily operations, Adrian began. and Eleanor heard several people cough to cover laughter. He had the grace to look embarrassed. That was a mistake, my mistake. I let my wife carry responsibilities I should have shared while I made other choices. The barn was very quiet now. Going forward, that changes. The Duchess will have formal legal authority to act for Thornfield, not as my agent, but as a co-holder of power. What she decides will carry the same weight as what I decide. Her signature will have the same validity as mine. Murmuring spread through the crowd. This was radical enough that even people who'd known Eleanor was the real authority looked shocked to hear it made official. I know this is unusual, Adrian continued. I know society will have opinions about it, but I also know that my wife has kept this estate running, kept you all safe and fed, while I was too blind to see or too proud to acknowledge it. So I'm acknowledging it now, publicly, and making sure no one can question her authority going forward. Thomas raised his hand. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but what does this mean for existing contracts? Some of us have leases signed by the Duchess, some signed by you. Are they all still valid? All valid, Eleanor confirmed. And any future contracts will be equally valid regardless of which signature is on them. We're having legal documents drawn up to make this absolutely clear. What about decisions? Mrs. Miller called out. If the Duchess says one thing and you say another, who do we listen to? It was the question Eleanor had been expecting. She glanced at Adrian, curious how he'd answer. Listen to whoever knows more about the specific issue, Adrian said after a moment. If it's about crops or tenant relations or financial planning, that's the Duchess. If it's about... He paused, clearly struggling to think of areas where he had more knowledge. Well, honestly, for most things, that's the Duchess. I'm learning, but I'm years behind. Use your judgment. The honesty landed well. People weren't used to nobility admitting ignorance so plainly. Right then, Thomas said. Let's get to business. We've got water issues in the southern section again. The meeting proceeded from there, falling into familiar patterns. Tenants raised problems. Eleanor asked clarifying questions. Solutions were proposed and debated. Adrian mostly stayed quiet, but she noticed him taking mental notes, watching how she navigated disagreements and balanced competing needs. The water issue was straightforward. A shared well was running low during afternoon hours, and families were arguing about usage priorities. Eleanor proposed a schedule system, got buy-in from the affected families, and moved on. Then Mrs. Carter from the Northern Farm stood up. I need to talk about the Jennings situation. The barn went very quiet. Eleanor felt tension spike immediately. Go ahead, she said carefully. Peter Jennings has been beating his wife, Mrs. Carter said bluntly. Everyone knows it. Sarah shows up to market with bruises, makes excuses. Last week she had a black eye so bad she couldn't open it properly. And nothing's been done. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She'd known about Peter Jennings, had been gathering evidence carefully, trying to build a case strong enough to act on without triggering violent backlash. But it was slow, delicate work. I'm aware of the situation, Eleanor said. I've been working on it isn't enough, Mrs. Carter interrupted. Sarah's scared for her life. Her children are scared. How much evidence do you need before you do something? It's not about evidence, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level. It's about having a solution that actually helps Sarah. If I evict Peter tomorrow, he'll just drag Sarah and the children away from Thornfield, and then she'll have no protection at all. I'm trying to what? Find a perfect answer that doesn't exist? Mrs. Carter's voice rose. My mother was beaten by my father for 20 years while people made excuses about why they couldn't help. It's complicated, they said. We need to be careful, they said. She died with bruises on her body, and everyone acted surprised. Eleanor felt Adrian shift beside her, probably preparing to intervene. She touched his arm lightly. Wait, you're right, Eleanor said to Mrs. Carter. There is no perfect answer, and I'm not trying to find one. I'm trying to find an answer that doesn't get Sarah killed. She addressed the whole gathering now. Peter Jennings is violent and dangerous. If I evict him, he'll view Sarah as the reason and likely kill her out of rage. If I have him arrested without enough evidence to hold him, he'll be released within days and the violence will escalate. So I've been working with Sarah directly, quietly helping her save money and make plans to leave safely with her children when the moment is right. And when will that be? Mrs. Carter demanded. How many more beatings while you wait for the right moment? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. I wish I did, but I also know that rushing in without a solid plan gets women killed. I've seen it happen. The barn was silent again. This was the messy, impossible part of authority that Adrian had never witnessed. The problems where every solution was inadequate, where doing nothing was terrible but acting recklessly was worse. What if we helped more directly? Thomas suggested. Some of us could make sure we're around their cottage more often. Peter's less likely to get violent if he knows neighbors are watching. He's also likely to forbid Sarah from having visitors, Eleanor replied. Isolation makes abuse easier. We need to be subtle. What about the church? Someone else called out. Could the vicar talk to him? Peter hasn't attended services in 2 years, Eleanor said. He has no respect for the vicar's authority. Then what do we do? Mrs. Carter's voice was thick with frustration. Just wait and hope Sarah survives long enough for your careful plan to work? Eleanor wanted to scream. Because yes, essentially, that was exactly what she was doing. And it felt monstrous even though she knew direct intervention would likely end worse. Adrian cleared his throat. What if we removed Peter instead of evicting him? Everyone turned to look at him. Adrian continued slowly, clearly working through the idea as he spoke. What if we found him work elsewhere? Somewhere far enough away that he'd have to relocate. Paid well enough that he'd want to take it, then Sarah and the children could stay here safe while he's gone. He'd never leave them behind, Mrs. Carter said. What if Sarah wasn't here when he left? Eleanor said, catching on to Adrian's thinking. What if we arranged for her to visit family? We'd create a family emergency, something requiring immediate travel. Peter goes to his new job, Sarah goes to her emergency, and when Peter eventually comes back to Thornfield to collect his family, we tell him Sarah decided not to return. He'll go looking for her, someone pointed out. To where? Eleanor countered. Sarah's family moved to the coast 2 years ago, opposite direction from wherever we send Peter. He doesn't know their address. And if Sarah's somewhere safe, supported by people who won't tell Peter where she is, what can he do? The plan was taking shape now, people contributing ideas. How to make the job offer seem legitimate, how to time Sarah's departure, how to support her financially until she could establish independence. It wasn't perfect. Peter might track her down eventually, might cause trouble when he realized what happened. But it was better than waiting for violence to escalate to murder. I can help with the job placement, Thomas offered. My brother works at a shipyard down south. Always needs strong backs, and it pays well. I'll talk to Sarah, Mrs. Carter said. Sound her out about whether she'd actually leave if given the chance. Some women are too scared to go even when they have the opportunity. Eleanor nodded. Do it carefully. If Peter suspects something, he'll tighten his control. The meeting continued for another hour, covering more mundane issues, fence repairs, crop prices, a dispute about shared equipment. But the energy had shifted. People had seen Eleanor acknowledge a problem she didn't have a perfect solution for, had watched her work with others to find something better than nothing, and they'd seen Adrian contribute something useful. When the meeting finally ended and people dispersed into the night, Eleanor felt exhausted. The weight of Peter Jennings's violence, Mrs. Carter's righteous anger, the knowledge that their plan might fail and Sarah might die anyway, it all pressed down on her shoulders. That was brutal, Adrian said as they walked back toward the main house. That was normal, Eleanor corrected. Every month there are problems like that. Situations where all the choices are bad and I have to pick the least terrible option. How do you stand it? Because the alternative is not trying, and that's worse. Eleanor looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. You did well tonight, by the way. The idea about relocating Peter, that might actually work. You would have thought of it eventually. Maybe, but you thought of it first. She glanced at him. That's what partnership looks like. Different perspectives solving problems neither of us could handle alone. They walked in silence for a while. Then Adrian said, Mrs. Carter's mother. Who was she? Ann Carter died 6 years ago, before I came to Thornfield. Her husband beat her throughout their marriage. Everyone knew, no one intervened. He killed her during a fight, claimed it was an accident, was acquitted of murder, served 2 years for manslaughter, got out and immediately found a new wife to terrorize. Eleanor's voice was flat. He died of drink 3 years ago. The new wife sent flowers to his grave every week for a month, then moved away and never looked back. How do you know all this? Because I asked, because understanding the history helps me navigate the present, because these aren't just tenants to me, Adrian. They're people with stories, traumas, hopes. And if I'm going to have authority over their lives, I damn well better know what those lives contain. They reached the main house. Lights glowed in windows, staff moving about their evening routines. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. But Eleanor knew better now. Every lit window contained complexity, difficulty, situations without easy answers. The authorization document is ready, she said. We'll sign it tomorrow morning, have it witnessed, and file it with the magistrate by noon. Once that's done, there's no going back. I know. Society will be vicious about it. Other lords will say I've unmanned you. Their wives will call me unnatural, ambitious, a bad example. We'll be social pariahs in certain circles. I know that too. Eleanor studied his face in the lamplight spilling from the nearest window. Then why are you doing it? Really? Because I don't think it's just about defeating Pembroke's Whisper campaign. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Because this morning, watching you with those tenants, seeing how much you know and how much you care, I realized I've spent 4 years being completely useless, decorative at best, actively harmful at worst. And I can't keep living like that. It's hollow. It's shameful. He met her eyes. I don't love you, Eleanor. I should, probably, after 4 years of marriage. But I don't. What I feel is more like awe, respect, maybe the beginning of something that could become partnership, and that's more real than whatever comfortable lie we've been living. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. I don't love you either, Eleanor replied. I'm not sure I'm capable of loving you after years of being invisible, but I can work with respect. I can build something from honesty. Then let's do that. They parted in the hallway, heading to separate bedrooms. Another fiction they maintained, though at least now they both acknowledged it was fiction. Eleanor prepared for bed slowly, her mind still churning through the day's events. Tomorrow, they'd sign the authorization. In a week, Pembroke's Whisper campaign would intensify as word spread about the formal power sharing. In a month, they might successfully relocate Peter Jennings and save Sarah's life, or they might fail and Eleanor would add another death to her conscience. In a year, who knew? The estate might thrive, or the social consequences of their unconventional arrangement might destroy them. But at least they'd be facing it honestly. Eleanor blew out her lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the old house settle around her. Somewhere in the estate, Sarah Jennings was probably lying awake too, wondering if hope was safe to feel. Somewhere, Pembroke was plotting his next move. Somewhere, the future was rushing toward them, whether they were ready or not. The door was open. The truth was out. And tomorrow, they'd make it permanent. Eleanor fell asleep thinking about contracts and cattle and copper mines and all the 1,000 complicated pieces of keeping an estate alive. She dreamed of ledgers that balanced themselves, of fences that repaired themselves, of problems that solved themselves while she slept. She woke at 4, like always, and got up to face reality. Reality arrived with a pounding on the door at dawn. Eleanor was already dressed, sitting at her desk, reviewing the authorization document one final time before the signing. The knock was urgent enough that she dropped her pen and moved quickly to the hallway. Mrs. Chen was already there, looking pale. Your Grace, it's Thomas, from the carpentry workshop. He says it's urgent. Thomas stood in the entrance hall, still wearing yesterday's clothes, covered in dust. His face was haggard. Your Grace, thank everything you're awake. We've got a serious problem. What happened? Peter Jennings found out about the meeting last night. Someone told him we discussed his situation. Thomas's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. He's barricaded himself in the cottage with Sarah and the children, won't let anyone near, and he's got a shotgun. Eleanor felt ice flood her veins. How do you know he has a gun? Because he fired it at Martin when Martin tried to check on Sarah this morning. Missed, but barely. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. We've got people keeping watch from a distance, making sure he doesn't leave with the family. But Your Grace, we need help. Real help. This is beyond what we can handle. Adrian appeared at the top of the stairs, half-dressed. What's going on? Peter Jennings has his family hostage, Eleanor said, her mind already racing through options. Thomas, how many people are watching the cottage? Maybe a dozen? Workers who live nearby, some tenant families. They're keeping clear of the property line, but maintaining a perimeter. Good. Keep them there, but tell them not to approach. No heroics. Eleanor moved toward the stairs, calling over her shoulder. Mrs. Chen, send for the magistrate. Tell him we have a hostage situation requiring immediate intervention, and send word to Dr. Morrison. We may need medical assistance. She took the stairs quickly, Adrian following. In her room, she pulled on riding boots while giving instructions. We need to contain this without escalation. Peter's desperate now, cornered. That makes him more dangerous, not less. Should we wait for the magistrate? Adrian asked. The magistrate is 3 hours away on a fast horse. A lot can happen in 3 hours. Eleanor grabbed a jacket. Besides, this is Thornfield land, our tenant, our responsibility. We don't get to wait for someone else to fix it. They rode hard toward the northern cottages, Thomas leading the way. As they approached, Eleanor could see the makeshift perimeter, workers and neighbors standing at cautious distances, watching the Jennings cottage like it might explode. Which, in a sense, it might. The cottage itself looked quiet from the outside. Shutters closed, door barred. No movement visible. But Eleanor knew Sarah and 3 children were inside with a violent man who now felt trapped. She dismounted and approached Martin, who had a bloody scrape on his arm from diving for cover. "Tell me exactly what happened." "I came by this morning to drop off some timber Peter had requested," Martin said. "Knocked on the door like normal. Peter opened it halfway, looking wild. Asked me what we discussed at the meeting last night. I tried to deflect, said it was just regular business, but he knew. Someone had told him we talked about him and Sarah." "Who?" Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Don't know, but he knew enough to be furious. Started yelling about people interfering in his marriage. Said no one had the right to talk about his private business. I tried to calm him down, said we were just concerned neighbors. That's when he pulled the shotgun, told me to get off his property and tell everyone else to mind their own affairs or he'd shoot the next person who came near." Eleanor scanned the gathered crowd. Most faces were familiar, people who'd been at last night's meeting. But there were a few she didn't recognize. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in tight communities. "Did anyone here tell Peter about the meeting?" she called out. Silence. People exchanged glances, but no one spoke. "I'm not asking to assign blame," Eleanor continued, voice carrying clearly. "I'm asking because I need to know what Peter knows. If someone told him details, I need to understand what information he's working with." More silence. Then a young woman Eleanor vaguely recognized stepped forward, face red with shame. "I did. I'm sorry, Your Grace. Peter's my cousin. I thought if he knew people were talking about it, he'd be shamed into stopping. I didn't think he'd—" "All right," Eleanor cut her off, not unkindly. "What exactly did you tell him?" "Just that the meeting discussed his treatment of Sarah, that people were concerned, that we were going to help her." The woman's voice cracked. "I didn't mention the plan about moving him away, just that we knew about the beatings and weren't going to ignore it anymore." So Peter knew he was being watched, knew intervention was coming, but didn't know the specific plan. That was something at least. "Everyone who's not essential, go home," Eleanor ordered. "You're making this feel like a siege, which will only make Peter more defensive. Thomas, Martin, and—" She scanned the crowd. "Mrs. Carter, you stay. Everyone else leave. Now." The crowd dispersed reluctantly. Eleanor waited until they were gone, then approached the cottage carefully, stopping well short of shotgun range. "Peter, it's Eleanor Vance. I need to talk to you." No response. "I know you're angry. I know you feel like we've invaded your privacy, but I need to know Sarah and the children are safe. Can you at least tell me that?" A long pause. Then Peter's voice, muffled by the closed shutters. "They're fine, and they'll stay that way as long as everyone leaves us alone." "I can't do that, Peter. Not when there's a gun involved and children in the house." "Then we have a problem." His voice was rising, edges of panic creeping in. "Because I'm not opening this door. I'm not letting anyone take my family. And I'm not going to be treated like some kind of criminal on my own property." Adrian moved closer to Eleanor, speaking quietly. "We need to de-escalate. Get him talking. Build rapport." "I know that," Eleanor murmured back. "But talking only works if he wants to listen." She raised her voice again. "Peter, I understand you're upset about last night's meeting. You have a right to be angry that people discussed your private matters. But you have to understand, when neighbors see someone being hurt, they can't just ignore it. Sarah's not hurt. She's clumsy. She falls. She bruises easy. Everyone's making something out of nothing." Mrs. Carter made a disgusted sound. Eleanor shot her a warning look. Not helpful right now. "Whether that's true or not, we can discuss later," Eleanor called out. "Right now I just need to know everyone's safe. Let me see Sarah and the children. Just a visual confirmation that they're all right." "So you can grab them and run? I'm not stupid." This was going nowhere. Peter was too worked up, too defensive. Eleanor needed a different approach. She turned to Thomas, keeping her voice low. "Is there a back way into that cottage? A window or door Peter might have overlooked and is barricading?" "There's a root cellar entrance around back. Opens into the kitchen, but he'd hear anyone coming up through it. Not if he's distracted." Eleanor's mind was working quickly now, assembling a plan that was probably reckless, but better than standing here while the situation deteriorated. "I'm going to keep him talking at the front. You circle around, check if the cellar door is accessible. If it is, get inside quietly and assess the situation. Don't engage unless Sarah or the children are in immediate danger. Your Grace, that's incredibly risky. Everything about this situation is risky, Eleanor interrupted. But we can't just wait and hope Peter calms down. He's spiraling. We need information about what's actually happening inside that cottage. Adrian grabbed her arm. If Thomas goes in and Peter hears him, people could die. If we do nothing and Peter's panic keeps building, people could die anyway, Eleanor shot back. At least this way we're acting instead of reacting. She turned to Mrs. Carter. I need you to be ready. If this goes wrong, if Peter starts shooting, you run for the magistrate's office. Don't wait for me to tell you. Just go. Mrs. Carter nodded grimly. Eleanor took a breath, steadying herself, then moved slightly closer to the cottage. Peter, I want to propose something, a negotiation. You let me see Sarah and the children, confirm they're safe, and I'll pull everyone back. Give you space and time to think. I don't need time to think. I need everyone to leave my family alone. I understand. But right now, you've got a dozen people watching your cottage. The magistrate is being summoned, and this situation is only going to get more complicated. If you let me verify everyone's safety, I can at least slow that down, buy you some breathing room. Behind the cottage, she saw Thomas's shadow move carefully toward the back. Her heart hammered, but she kept her face calm, her voice steady. What guarantee do I have? Peter called out. His voice sounded slightly more to the left now. Good, he was moving away from the kitchen. My word, Eleanor replied. I know that might not mean much to you right now, but it's all I can offer. Let me see your family is safe, and I'll pull back the crowd, delay the magistrate's intervention, give you time to think through your options. Another long pause. Eleanor could hear her own pulse in her ears. Thomas should be at the cellar door by now. If it was locked, this whole plan fell apart. How do I know you won't try to grab them? Peter asked. Because I'll stay 20 feet from the door. Sarah can stand in the doorway, children beside her. I'll see they're unharmed. You'll see I'm keeping my distance. 5 seconds. That's all I need. She was buying time now, letting Thomas get into position. Every second Peter spent focused on her was a second he wasn't paying attention to his back entrance. Fine, Peter said finally. 20 feet. No tricks. Eleanor positioned herself exactly 20 feet from the front door, measuring the distance carefully. Adrian stayed beside her, tense as a drawn bow. Mrs. Carter watched from the perimeter, ready to run. The door opened a crack. Eleanor could see Peter's shape in the darkness inside, the shotgun visible in his hands. Then Sarah appeared, pushed forward into the doorway. The children clustered behind her, 2 girls maybe 8 and 6, a boy who couldn't be more than 4. Sarah's face was a mask of terror barely held together, fresh bruising on her jaw. Her eyes met Eleanor's for just a moment, and in that moment Eleanor saw absolute desperation. They're safe, Peter said. You see? Everyone's fine, now leave. A crash from inside the cottage. Thomas must have knocked something over. Peter whirled, the shotgun swinging away from the door toward the interior. Sarah, run! Eleanor shouted. Sarah grabbed the 2 nearest children and dove out the door. The little boy, farther back, froze in fear. Peter realized what was happening, started to turn back. Adrian was already moving. He sprinted forward, faster than Eleanor had ever seen him move, and scooped up the boy just as Peter's attention snapped back to the doorway. The shotgun came up. Get down! Thomas's voice from inside the cottage. Peter spun, confused, the gun tracking between targets. Adrian hit the ground hard, sheltering the boy with his body. Eleanor grabbed Sarah and the 2 girls, dragging them back toward the perimeter. Everything was chaos, movement, shouting. The shotgun fired. The blast was deafening. Eleanor's ears rang. She looked back frantically. Adrian was on the ground, the boy beneath him, both unmoving. Peter stood in the doorway, the shotgun smoking in his hands, his face a mixture of rage and horror at what he'd just done. Then Thomas appeared behind Peter, tackling him from inside the cottage. They went down hard, struggling for the gun. Another shot fired into the air, more shouting, people running forward now that the immediate danger had shifted. Eleanor pushed Sarah and the girls toward Mrs. Carter. Get them away from here, then ran toward the tangle of bodies near the cottage door. Thomas had gotten the gun away from Peter, but Peter was fighting like a cornered animal, all desperate strength and no technique. Martin and 2 other men reached them, helping to pin Peter down. The fight went out of him suddenly, like a puppet with cut strings. He collapsed into sobs, incoherent, broken. Eleanor ignored him, running to where Adrian lay. Are you hit? Adrian, are you hit? He rolled over carefully, the little boy clutched against his chest. Both of them looked stunned but intact. The boy was crying but moving, no blood visible. "We're all right," Adrian gasped. "The shot went wide. We're all right." Eleanor felt her knees go weak. She sat down hard in the dirt, breathing fast, the adrenaline finally catching up to her. Around them, people were securing Peter, checking on Thomas, making sure no one was seriously injured. It was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The magistrate arrived 2 hours later, by which time Peter had been bound and placed under guard in a storage building. Sarah and the children were in the main house being checked by Dr. Morrison. Thomas had a split lip and bruised ribs from the fight. Adrian had scraped his arms and face diving for the child but was otherwise fine, and Eleanor was sitting in her office, trying to stop her hands from shaking. She'd come so close to getting people killed. If Adrian hadn't been fast enough, if Thomas had been spotted earlier, if Peter's aim had been better, the margins had been terrifyingly thin. A knock on the door. The magistrate, a stern man named Whitmore, entered without waiting for permission. "Duchess, I need to understand what happened here." Eleanor explained the situation, Peter's violence, the meeting, the escalation. Whitmore listened with an increasingly grave expression. "You should have sent for me immediately when you learned about the abuse," he said when she finished. "Not tried to handle it yourselves." "With respect, Magistrate, we did try to handle it properly. Gathering evidence, building a case, planning a safe extraction. Peter's cousin is the one who precipitated the crisis by telling him about our discussions. Nevertheless, the result was a man firing a shotgun at a child and a duke. That's attempted murder, multiple counts." Whitmore's tone was sharp. "This could have been avoided with proper legal intervention." Eleanor bit back a sharp retort. Whitmore hadn't seen the bruises on Sarah's body, didn't know how many times proper legal intervention had failed to protect women from violent husbands. But arguing with him wouldn't help Sarah. "What happens to Peter now?" she asked instead. "He'll be tried for assault with a deadly weapon at minimum. Given that he shot at nobility, the charges will be severe. He'll hang, most likely." "And Sarah? What about her?" Whitmore looked confused. "She's just lost her husband, traumatized her children, and has no means of support. What happens to her and the children?" "That's not a legal matter, Your Grace. That's a family matter." "It's a Thornfield matter," Eleanor corrected. "She's our tenant. Those children grew up on our land. We're not abandoning them to poverty because their father was a violent fool." Whitmore's expression soured. "I've heard about your unconventional approach to estate management, Duchess. And I've heard about the document you plan to file today, granting yourself authority normally reserved for the title holder. I have to say, I'm not impressed." "I don't need you to be impressed," Eleanor said quietly. "I need you to do your job and see that Peter Jennings faces justice. What I do with Sarah and her children is my concern." "Is it?" Whitmore leaned forward. "Because I've also heard that Lord Pembroke is raising questions about your legal authority, questions about whether contracts you've signed are valid. And I have to tell you, Duchess, those questions have merit." Eleanor went very still. "Explain." "You've been operating without explicit written authorization from your husband. That makes every decision you've made technically subject to challenge. Lord Pembroke is arguing that several contracts, including some tenant leases, should be voided as unauthorized. That's absurd. My husband has tacitly approved every decision I've made. Tacit approval isn't legal authorization. And Lord Pembroke has filed formal challenges with my office regarding 3 specific contracts. He's requesting full review and potential invalidation." Eleanor's mind raced. This was the attack she'd anticipated, but Pembroke had moved faster than expected. He wasn't just spreading rumors. He was using legal channels to undermine her authority. "Which contracts?" she asked. Whitmore consulted a paper. "A timber sale to Marchmont Mills, a boundary agreement with the neighboring Ashford estate, and a mineral rights lease for the Eastern Quarry." Eleanor knew those contracts intimately. The timber sale had saved Thornfield from a cash crisis 2 years ago. The boundary agreement had resolved a decades-old dispute. The quarry lease provided steady income and local employment. If those contracts were invalidated, the consequences would ripple across the entire estate. "Lord Pembroke has no standing to challenge those contracts," Eleanor said. "He's not a party to any of them. He claims injury as the neighboring landowner, says the boundary agreement with Ashford affects his property interests, and he's arguing that if those contracts are invalid, it sets precedent for questioning all your other decisions." Whitmore's tone was almost sympathetic now. "I'm not saying I agree with him, Duchess. But the law is the law. If you've been operating without proper authorization, those contracts are vulnerable. Then it's fortunate we have that authorization ready to file, Adrian said from the doorway. Both Eleanor and Whitmore turned. Adrian stood there holding the leather document case, looking exhausted but determined. We're filing the authorization this morning, Adrian continued, moving into the room. It grants my wife full legal authority to act on Thornfield's behalf, co-equal authority with my own. And it retroactively validates every decision she's made since our marriage. Retroactive validation is legally questionable, Whitmore warned. Then let it be questioned in court, Adrian replied. We'll argue that my tacit approval over 4 years constitutes implicit authorization that we're now making explicit. No contract was made against my wishes or without my knowledge. I simply trusted my wife to handle estate operations while I was otherwise occupied. Lord Pembroke will argue you were deceived, that your wife manipulated you into granting authority you wouldn't have given if you'd known the full situation. Let him argue it, Eleanor said. We'll produce testimony from staff, tenants, merchants, everyone who witnessed my work over 4 years. We'll show that the estate prospered under my management, that tenants were better treated, that debts were restructured and paid. Let Pembroke try to convince a court that prosperity and good management constitute deception. Whitmore studied them both. You're choosing a very public battle. The social consequences will be severe. We're already facing those consequences, Adrian said. Pembroke's whisper campaign started yesterday. We can either fight on the defensive, apologizing and retreating, or we can fight on offense, making our case openly. And Peter Jennings? This morning's disaster won't help your cause. People will say a woman's authority leads to chaos and violence. People already say that, Eleanor replied. They say women are too emotional to lead, too weak to make hard decisions. This morning, my husband saved a child's life while I evacuated the rest of the family. I'd say that demonstrates partnership, not chaos. Others might say it demonstrates that you provoked a violent man into an armed standoff that could have killed multiple people. The words hit like a slap. Because Whitmore was right. That was exactly how this would be framed by Eleanor's critics. The fact that Peter's violence predated her intervention wouldn't matter. The optics were terrible. Nevertheless, Eleanor said quietly, we're filing the authorization. Today. And we're prepared to defend it against any legal challenge. Whitmore stood. Then I'll process the filing, but I'm warning you both. This fight will get ugly. Lord Pembroke has resources and connections, and public opinion is not on your side. After he left, Eleanor and Adrian sat in heavy silence. He's right, Eleanor said finally. This morning made everything worse. Peter firing at you, the chaos, the near tragedy. It all plays into the narrative that I'm dangerous, that women in authority create disorder. Or it shows that you handled a crisis situation with courage and quick thinking, Adrian countered. You saved Sarah and her children. You neutralized a violent threat. Those are positives. Not when filtered through society's lens. They'll say I provoked Peter by interfering in his marriage. They'll say a proper woman would have deferred to male authority, to you, to the magistrate, to anyone but herself. Then let them say it. Adrian placed the document case on her desk. We knew this would be hard. We knew society would push back, but we also know the alternative is you going back into the shadows, and that's not sustainable. Eleanor opened the case, looking at the carefully drafted authorization. Page after page of legal language, all boiling down to one simple fact. She would have power. Real, acknowledged, legal power. And it would cost them everything. My father's associates will cut us off socially, Adrian said, as if reading her thoughts. My mother will be horrified. We'll be excluded from events, whispered about, treated as curiosities at best and threats at worst. You could still back out, Eleanor offered, even though the thought made her stomach turn. We could tear this up, issue a simpler document that grants limited authorization. Keep the scope narrow, the language apologetic. No. Adrian's voice was firm. I watched you this morning. Saw you think 10 steps ahead while everyone else was panicking. Saw you risk yourself to save a family. And I realized something. You're better at this than I'll ever be. Not because you're trying to dominate or control, but because you actually care about getting it right. He met her eyes. I've been useless for 4 years, Eleanor. Worse than useless, actively harmful. I shared secrets that armed our enemies. I neglected responsibilities that fell on your shoulders. I took credit for work I didn't do while you did the actual labor of keeping us afloat. And I did all of it while feeling vaguely proud of myself for being a duke. Adrian stood, moved to the window overlooking the estate. I don't want to be that person anymore. And I can't become someone better by taking half measures or protecting my pride. So yes, we're filing this document. Yes, we're fighting Pembroke openly. And yes, we're accepting whatever social consequences come with it. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not love, they weren't there yet. Might never be there. But respect. Genuine respect for someone choosing difficulty over comfort, truth over convenient fiction. All right, she said. Let's do it properly then. We'll ride to the magistrate's office together, file the document publicly, and make sure everyone knows exactly what we're claiming. Together, Adrian agreed. They signed the document at Eleanor's desk. Her signature first, bold and clear, then Adrian's beside it. 2 witnesses were called, Mrs. Chen and Henderson. Both signed without hesitation, though Henderson looked like he was watching the world turn upside down. This is historic, Your Grace, Mrs. Chen said quietly to Eleanor. Whatever happens, this matters. Or it's a disaster that ruins us, Eleanor replied. Hard to say which yet. Sometimes they're the same thing. The ride to the magistrate's office was tense. Word had spread about the morning's events. People stopped to stare as Eleanor and Adrian passed, conversations dying mid-sentence. At the magistrate's office, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by rumors of something significant happening. Lord Garrett Pembroke was among them. He stood near the entrance, surrounded by associates, his expression carefully neutral. But Eleanor saw triumph in his eyes. He thought he'd won, thought the morning's chaos had destroyed whatever credibility she'd built. Lord Pembroke, Eleanor said coolly, dismounting, how convenient to find you here. Duchess, I heard about this morning's tragedy. So terrible. I do hope everyone is recovering. His tone was dripping with false sympathy. Everyone is fine, thank you. We're here to file documents. So I understand. Authorization papers, Whitmore mentioned. How very necessary, given the legal questions surrounding your recent activities. Eleanor smiled tightly. Necessary because you've been raising baseless challenges to valid contracts. But don't worry, after today you'll have no grounds for those challenges. We'll see, Pembroke said. The law is quite clear about authorization requirements. Retroactive attempts to create authority often fail under scrutiny. Then scrutinize away, Adrian said, stepping forward. We welcome legal review of our arrangement. Every aspect of it is sound. Is it? Pembroke's gaze shifted to Adrian. Tell me, Duke, did you know about your wife's activities over the past 4 years? Every contract she signed, every negotiation she conducted? Or were you distracted? The implication was clear. Adrian had been ignorant, possibly deceived. Eleanor felt her hands clench, but Adrian's response was calm. I knew my wife was managing estate operations. I trusted her judgment and approved her decisions. The fact that I didn't micromanage every detail doesn't invalidate her authority. It demonstrates my confidence in her abilities. Confidence or negligence? Pembroke pressed. There's a difference between delegation and abdication. And from what I hear, you abdicated entirely while your wife played at being Duke. My wife didn't play at anything, Adrian replied, voice hardening. She saved a failing estate while I was too proud and too foolish to help her. That's not her fault. It's mine. And I'm correcting it now by formally acknowledging what was already true. She has been and continues to be Thornfield's primary authority. Murmurs ran through the gathered crowd. This was more candid than nobility usually got in public. People were fascinated, appalled, riveted. Pembroke's smile didn't waver. How very modern of you, Duke. I'm sure society will have opinions about a man so thoroughly dominated by his wife that he publicly admits to being useless. Better to be honest about my failures than to pretend competence I don't have, Adrian shot back. Unlike some lords who hide their inadequacies behind bluster and legal harassment, Pembroke's smile finally cracked. Careful, Duke. You're choosing a very dangerous enemy. You chose to be our enemy when you tried to steal our land, Eleanor interjected. We're just responding appropriately. She brushed past him into the magistrate's office, Adrian following. The crowd pressed closer, trying to hear, trying to see. This was spectacle now. Entertainment and scandal rolled into one. Inside, Whitmore waited with his clerk. You're determined to do this publicly? We're determined to do it properly, Eleanor replied, which means witnessed, filed, and registered with full transparency. No room for later claims that we hid something or acted improperly. The filing process was simple but felt monumental. The document was read aloud, witnessed by Whitmore and his clerk, stamped with official seals, and entered into the public record. With each step, Eleanor felt reality shifting around her. She had power now. legal, documented, challengeable, but real power. And outside, Pembroke was already planning how to destroy her for claiming it. When they emerged from the office, the crowd had grown. Dozens of people now, drawn by gossip and curiosity. Pembroke stood front and center, clearly ready for another confrontation. "Well," he called out, "is it done? Has the Duke officially surrendered his authority to his wife?" "The Duke has officially acknowledged his wife's co-equal authority," Eleanor corrected. "Reading comprehension might serve you better than mockery, Lord Pembroke." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Pembroke's face darkened. "This won't stand," he said. "I'm filing formal legal challenges to your authorization, your contracts, and your competence to manage an estate of Thornfield's size. We'll see what the courts say about a woman claiming authority that belongs by law to her husband." "File whatever you like," Eleanor replied. "We'll defend every challenge. And while you're spending your time and money on legal harassment, we'll be doing what we've always done, actually running our estate successfully." "You had one job this morning," Pembroke said, his voice rising. "Protect your tenants. Instead, you provoked a violent man into an armed standoff that nearly killed a child and a duke. That's not success, Duchess. That's catastrophic failure." The crowd went quiet. This was the attack Eleanor had known was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of dozens of witnesses still felt like a gut punch. "Peter Jennings beat his wife for years," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly. "Everyone knew. Everyone saw the bruises. And everyone did nothing because interfering in a man's private business wasn't acceptable. This morning we stopped doing nothing. We tried to help a woman and her children escape violence. Yes, it went badly. Yes, shots were fired. But Sarah and her children are safe now, and Peter will face justice. That's not failure. That's choosing action over comfortable inaction." "It's recklessness," Pembroke countered. "It's what happens when women try to handle situations requiring strength and authority. You created chaos where experienced male leadership would have maintained order." "Experienced male leadership?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "You mean the kind that lets women be beaten for decades while authorities look the other way? The kind that values property rights over human lives? The kind that protects violent men because acknowledging their violence might be uncomfortable?" She stepped closer to Pembroke, ignoring Adrian's warning hand on her arm. "You want to challenge my competence? Fine. Let's compare results. In 4 years, I've turned Thornfield from near bankruptcy to profitability. I've restructured debt, improved tenant conditions, resolved long-standing disputes, and built relationships that protect our interests across the region. What have you accomplished, Lord Pembroke, besides failed land grabs and spreading poison about women who threaten your sense of superiority?" The crowd was dead silent now. No one spoke to Pembroke like this. No one dared. Pembroke's face had gone red. "You're proving my point, Duchess. You're emotional, aggressive, unable to maintain proper decorum. This is exactly why women shouldn't hold authority. They can't control themselves enough to wield it responsibly." "I'm perfectly controlled," Eleanor replied, her voice like ice despite the fury burning in her chest. "I'm simply done pretending that your attacks deserve polite responses. You tried to steal our land. You failed. You tried to undermine my contracts. You're failing, and now you're trying to destroy my reputation because you can't defeat me legally. So yes, I'm aggressive in defending what I've built. Call that emotional if you want. I call it effective. We'll see how effective you are when the courts strip away your pretend authority," Pembroke snarled. "When society shuns you for your unnatural behavior. When your husband finally realizes what a manipulative harpy he's married to and takes back the power you've stolen." "I haven't stolen anything," Eleanor said quietly. "I've earned everything I have, every acre of respect, every ounce of authority. And you can't stand it because you've never earned anything in your life. You just inherited it and assumed that made you superior." Adrian stepped forward, placing himself physically between Eleanor and Pembroke. "This conversation is over. You've made your intentions clear, Lord Pembroke. We'll see you in court." "Yes, you will," Pembroke agreed. "And when this is over, Duchess, you'll be back where you belong, silent, invisible, powerless, the way nature intended." He turned and walked away, his associates following. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with gossip and speculation. Tomorrow, this confrontation would be the talk of every estate within 100 miles. Eleanor felt Adrian's hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" "No," she admitted. "That was worse than I expected. More public, more vicious." "You held your own." "I lost my temper. That's exactly what he wanted. Proof that I'm too emotional to have authority." "You stood up for yourself," Adrian corrected. "There's a difference." They rode back to Thornfield in silence. the weight of what they'd just done settling over them. The authorization was filed, the gauntlet was thrown, and Pembroke's counterattack was already beginning. At the estate, chaos awaited them. Sarah Jennings was having a breakdown in the guest room, overwhelmed by trauma and uncertainty about her future. The children were terrified, not understanding why their father had tried to hurt them. Workers were agitated, worried about the morning's violence and what it meant for estate safety. And in the midst of it all, Eleanor had to keep functioning, had to make decisions, provide leadership, maintain the stability that Thornfield depended on. She found Sarah in the guest room with Dr. Morrison, who was trying to calm her with sedatives. The woman was shaking, crying, caught between relief at being safe and guilt about her husband's fate. "He's going to hang," Sarah sobbed. "Because of me, because I couldn't just—" "He's going to hang because he beat you for years and then fired a weapon at a child," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "None of this is your fault, Sarah. None of it. But the children, they'll grow up knowing their father was executed. They'll grow up knowing their father was violent and their mother was brave enough to escape," Eleanor said. "That's the story that matters." She knelt beside Sarah's chair. "I know this is overwhelming. I know it feels like everything's falling apart. But you're safe now. Your children are safe, and we're going to make sure you stay that way." "How?" Sarah's voice was small, broken. "I have no money, no family nearby, no way to support 3 children." "You have Thornfield," Eleanor said. "We'll rework your lease so you can stay in a cottage without Peter. We'll find you work that accommodates caring for your children, and we'll make sure you have resources to build a new life. You're not alone in this." Dr. Morrison caught Eleanor's eye, gave a small nod of approval. Sarah's crying slowed, stabilized into exhausted silence. Eleanor stayed with her for another hour, making practical plans, offering concrete solutions to immediate problems. It was easier than thinking about Pembroke's threats, about the legal battles ahead, about the social destruction that was probably already beginning. When she finally made it back to her own office, night had fallen. The authorization document sat on her desk, officially stamped and registered. Beside it, a stack of messages that had arrived during the day, some supportive, most not. Lady Hartwell, Adrian's mother, demanding to know what madness had possessed her son. The county guild withdrawing an invitation for Eleanor to speak at their annual gathering. 3 tenant families requesting meetings to clarify their lease situations. And at the bottom, a single line note from Pembroke. "This is just the beginning." Eleanor stared at the note, feeling exhaustion press down on her like a physical weight. She'd won the first battle. The authorization was filed and legal. But the war was just starting, and she was already tired. A knock on the door. Adrian entered without waiting, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed her one without a word. "I'm not supposed to drink this," Eleanor said absently. "Not ladylike." "Nothing about today was ladylike," Adrian replied. "Drink." She drank. The whiskey burned, sharp and clarifying. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" she said. "Yes. Pembroke's going to come at us from every angle. Legal challenges, social pressure, economic warfare. Probably. And we might lose everything. The estate, our reputation, our ability to protect the people who depend on us." Adrian sat down across from her. "We might, but we also might win. We might set a precedent that helps other women claim authority in their own lives. We might force society to acknowledge that competence matters more than gender. We might actually change something. Or we might just destroy ourselves for nothing," Eleanor said bitterly. "Maybe." Adrian sipped his own whiskey. "But I'd rather destroy myself fighting for something real than preserve myself by living a comfortable lie. And I think you feel the same way." He was right. Eleanor knew he was right, but that didn't make the weight any lighter. "What's our next move?" she asked. "We prepare for battle," Adrian said. "We secure our allies, document our successes, build our case, and we make sure that when Pembroke attacks, we're ready to defend ourselves. He has resources we don't have, connections, wealth, social standing that makes ours look provincial. He also has weaknesses we can exploit. His attack on the Northern Valley was based on fraud. His whisper campaign relies on people not knowing the truth about Thornfield's operations. And his attempt to use Peter Jennings' violence against you requires people to ignore years of abuse that preceded our intervention." Eleanor looked at the documents spread across her desk, evidence of 4 years of quiet work, of problems solved, and disasters averted. "We'll need to make all of this public. Every decision I made, every success, Every way I protected Thornfield while others thought Adrian was managing things. That means exposing my failures, Adrian said quietly, making it very clear how useless I was. Yes, I'm all right with that, he said. If my humiliation helps prove your competence, it's a price worth paying. Eleanor studied him in the lamplight, this man she'd married without love and learned to respect through crisis. When did you grow a spine? He laughed, surprising them both. This morning, I think, when I grabbed that child and heard the shotgun fire. I realized that if I was going to die, I'd rather die doing something useful than waste away in comfortable mediocrity. That's a depressing epiphany, but an effective one. They sat in silence for a while, drinking whiskey and contemplating the battles ahead. Outside, Thornfield settled into night, familiar, fragile, worth fighting for. We should sleep, Eleanor said finally. Tomorrow we start building our defense. Tomorrow, Adrian agreed. But neither of them moved, because tomorrow meant facing consequences, and tonight meant sitting in the last quiet moment before the storm truly hit. The office door stood open, as it had since yesterday morning. The truth was out, the authorization was filed, and there was no going back. Eleanor Vance had claimed power openly, and the world was about to make her pay for it. The world made Eleanor pay for exactly 3 weeks before it started paying her back. The first week was brutal. Invitations withdrawn, cold shoulders at the market, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Adrian's mother arrived unannounced, spent 2 hours berating her son for becoming a laughingstock, and left without speaking to Eleanor at all. 2 merchant contracts were suddenly under review. A tenant family that had seemed solid for years gave notice, claiming they'd found better opportunities elsewhere, though everyone knew Pembroke had offered them money to leave. Eleanor worked through it all with mechanical efficiency, responding to each crisis as it arose while building their legal defense. She documented every success, gathered testimony from satisfied tenants, compiled financial records showing Thornfield's transformation from near bankruptcy to stability. The work was tedious, exhausting, and felt utterly futile when stacked against the weight of social disapproval crushing down on them. The second week brought the formal legal challenges. Pembroke filed suit questioning 3 major contracts. His legal team was expensive and thorough, picking apart every technical detail, exploiting every possible ambiguity in the authorization language. Eleanor spent 16-hour days with their solicitor, crafting responses, finding precedents, building arguments that felt like sandcastles against an incoming tide. Adrian helped where he could, but mostly he absorbed social punishment. His club membership was suspended pending review. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. At a county meeting, Lord Hartwell publicly called him a disgrace to his father's memory, and walked out. Adrian came home that night looking gray, poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, and said nothing for an hour. Eleanor found him later in his father's old study, staring at a portrait of the previous Duke, a stern man who'd apparently been everything Adrian wasn't. He would have hated this, Adrian said quietly. Hated you, hated me for supporting you, hated everything we're doing. I know, Eleanor replied. He used to tell me that a duke's authority was sacred, that the title carried responsibility you couldn't share or delegate, that real men controlled their households and their estates without question. Adrian's voice was flat. He'd think I was pathetic. Your father gambled away most of the family fortune, Eleanor pointed out. His sacred authority nearly destroyed Thornfield. Maybe his opinion isn't worth much. Adrian laughed bitterly. Probably not, but it still gets under my skin. All those voices saying I'm weak, dominated, not a real man. I know they're wrong, but it still hurts, Eleanor finished. I know. Every woman who whispers about me being unnatural, every merchant who questions whether I'm competent to negotiate, every social cut. I know they're wrong too, but it wears you down. They sat in silence for a while, 2 people who'd never expected to be allies, now bound together by mutual ostracism. We could still back down, Adrian said. Withdraw some of the authorization, make apologetic noises, try to rehabilitate our reputations. Could we, though? Eleanor asked. Really? Or would that just confirm everything they're saying, that I overstepped, that you were manipulated, that women can't handle real authority? We'd lose the fight and validate their worst assumptions. Probably. Adrian finished his whiskey. So we keep going. We keep going. The third week brought the turning point, though Eleanor didn't recognize it at first. It started with the Ashford boundary dispute, one of the contracts Pembroke was challenging. Lord Ashford, a neighbor who'd stayed carefully neutral through the conflict, requested a meeting. Eleanor expected him to withdraw from the agreement, adding another loss to their mounting pile. Instead, he arrived with his own solicitor and a stack of documents. "Duchess," Ashford said without preamble, "Lord Pembroke's challenge to our boundary agreement is based on a claim that you lacked authority to negotiate on Thornfield's behalf. Is that correct?" "That's his argument, yes," Eleanor confirmed carefully. "And his legal team has requested that I provide testimony about the negotiation process, specifically whether I understood you to be acting with your husband's full authorization." Eleanor's stomach sank. Ashford had negotiated directly with her, barely involving Adrian at all. If he testified honestly about that, it would support Pembroke's challenge. "I'll be honest with you," Ashford continued. "When we negotiated that boundary agreement 2 years ago, I knew you were the real authority at Thornfield. Everyone in the region knew. Your husband was rarely present, and when he was, he deferred to your knowledge." "Lord Ashford, let me finish." Ashford leaned forward. "Pembroke thinks that helps his case, that it proves you were operating without proper authorization. But here's what he's missing. I preferred negotiating with you. You knew the land better than your husband. You understood the water rights issues, the historical surveys, the practical implications. Working with you was efficient and professional. Working with the Duke would have been a disaster." He slid the documents across the table. "So I've prepared testimony for the court. Yes, I negotiated primarily with you. Yes, I knew you were the real decision maker, and yes, I considered that entirely proper because you were clearly acting with your husband's knowledge and approval. The contract is valid, the negotiation was sound, and Pembroke's challenge is garbage." Eleanor stared at him. "Why are you doing this? Supporting us will cost you socially." "Because Pembroke tried to bully me into supporting his challenge," Ashford said bluntly. "Sent his people to suggest that if I didn't cooperate, he'd make trouble for my own estate operations. I don't respond well to threats, and frankly, I'm tired of watching competent women get destroyed for being competent." He stood. "My wife is smarter than me about half our estate business. I'm not fool enough to ignore her just because society says I should. You did the work, Duchess. You earned the authority you're claiming. I'll testify to that in court, and Pembroke can choke on it." After he left, Eleanor sat in stunned silence. Their first real ally, their first witness willing to publicly support her authority. Adrian appeared in the doorway. "I heard. That's good, right?" "It's better than good," Eleanor said slowly. "It's a crack in Pembroke's strategy. He's been assuming everyone will either stay neutral or support him. But if Ashford testifies for us, others might follow," Adrian finished. "People who've been afraid to speak up might find courage. Or Pembroke might increase pressure on potential allies," Eleanor countered. "Make examples of anyone who supports us. Only one way to find out." Adrian moved to her desk, looking at the list of people they'd planned to approach for support. "Let's start making calls, see who else is willing to stand with us." The response surprised them both. Of 15 estate holders they contacted, 6 agreed to meet. 3 were immediately supportive. They'd worked with Eleanor over the years and respected her competence. 2 were cautious but willing to provide limited testimony. 1 was hostile and reported their contact directly to Pembroke. But 6 was more than 0. 6 was the beginning of something. The real shift came from an unexpected quarter, the tenants themselves. Word had spread about Pembroke's legal challenges, particularly his claim that Eleanor's contracts might be invalid. For tenant families, this wasn't abstract legal theory. It was a direct threat to their leases, their homes, their livelihoods. If the contracts Eleanor had negotiated were voided, they'd be thrown back into the harsh terms that had existed before she took over. Thomas organized them. Without asking permission, without official approval, he gathered tenant representatives and drafted a petition. 23 families signed it, representing more than half of Thornfield's tenant population. He presented it to Eleanor during breakfast, looking nervous but determined. "Your Grace, we want this entered into the legal record, testimony from the people who've actually lived under your management." Eleanor read the petition slowly. It was blunt, unpolished, and devastatingly effective. Family after family describing specific improvements Eleanor had made. Fairer lease terms, better maintenance, actual response to problems instead of bureaucratic delay. Several mentioned the contrast with how things had been run before her involvement. One family explicitly stated they'd leave Thornfield if Eleanor's authority was removed. "This is," Eleanor's voice caught, "this is remarkable. It's the truth," Thomas said simply. "You've worked for us, Your Grace. Now we're working for you." Pembroke will try to dismiss this as coerced, Eleanor warned. He'll claim I pressured tenants into supporting me. Let him try. We'll testify in person if needed. Tell the court exactly what Thornfield was like before you took over and what it's like now. Thomas's expression was fierce. We're not afraid of Pembroke, and we're not going to let him destroy the person who's actually been protecting us. After he left, Eleanor sat holding the petition, reading it over and over. She'd spent 4 years working invisibly, never expecting recognition, never asking for gratitude. Having it offered now, freely and publicly, felt almost painful in its intensity. Adrian found her still sitting there an hour later, tears on her face. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Eleanor managed. Everything's... I didn't think they'd do this. Didn't think they'd risk themselves to support me. Adrian read the petition, his own eyes going suspiciously bright. You gave them something worth protecting. They're returning the favor. But if we lose, Pembroke could make trouble for every family that signed this. He could... They know that, Adrian interrupted. They're doing it anyway. That's what makes it meaningful. The petition changed the legal landscape. Pembroke's argument relied heavily on the claim that Eleanor had operated without proper accountability, that her decisions had been arbitrary and potentially harmful. 23 tenant families testifying otherwise gutted that narrative. Their solicitor was almost giddy when he saw it. This is exactly what we needed. Concrete evidence that your management was not only authorized but beneficial. Pembroke can argue legal technicalities all he wants, but he can't argue with results this documented. The next court session was scheduled for the following week. Eleanor spent the intervening days preparing, reviewing her testimony, memorizing dates and figures and details. She'd be questioned under oath, her competence examined publicly, every decision dissected by Pembroke's legal team. The night before the hearing, she barely slept. Adrian found her at 3 a.m, still reviewing documents by lamplight. You need to rest, he said. I need to be perfect tomorrow. One mistake, one forgotten detail, and Pembroke's lawyers will tear me apart. You won't be perfect, Adrian said. No one is. But you'll be prepared, and you'll be honest, and that will have to be enough. What if it isn't? Adrian sat down across from her. Then we lose, and it will be terrible, and we'll deal with it. But Eleanor, you've already won in the ways that matter. Those tenant families, Lord Ashford, the people who've seen your work and respect it, that's real. Whatever happens in court tomorrow can't erase that. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but fear was a living thing in her chest, squeezing tight. The courtroom was packed. Apparently the case had become entertainment, the unnatural Duchess defending her stolen authority, the humiliated Duke supporting her, the powerful Lord trying to destroy them both. People filled every seat, lined the walls, pressed against windows to watch. Pembroke sat with his legal team, looking confident. His lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Blackwell, had a reputation for destroying witnesses under cross-examination. Eleanor wore her most severe dress, hair pulled back ruthlessly, no jewelry except her wedding ring. She wanted to look like authority itself, cold, competent, unshakable. She felt like she might vomit. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Justice Thornbury, called the court to order. Eleanor was surprised. She'd expected a male judge, had prepared for additional prejudice to overcome. Thornbury's presence was a small mercy. We're here to address challenges to several contracts executed by Duchess Eleanor Vance on behalf of the Thornfield estate, Thornbury began. Lord Pembroke's suit claims these contracts are invalid due to improper authorization. The defense argues that Duchess Vance operated with full authorization from her husband, the legal title holder. We'll hear arguments from both sides, examine evidence, and determine the validity of the disputed contracts. Blackwell stood for the opening argument. He was good. Eleanor had to admit that. He laid out a clear, logical case. Eleanor had operated without explicit written authorization for 4 years. She'd signed contracts, negotiated agreements, made financial decisions, all without formal legal backing. The fact that her husband had retroactively approved these actions didn't validate them, because authorization must precede action, not follow it. The law is clear on this point, Blackwell argued. A wife cannot bind her husband's estate without his explicit documented permission. Duchess Vance may have acted with good intentions. Her management may have been competent. But good intentions and competence do not create legal authority where none exists. These contracts are void, and they must be treated as such. He sat down looking satisfied. Their solicitor, a careful man named Edwards, stood for the defense. He was less flashy than Blackwell, but thorough. He argued that authorization didn't require specific written documents for every action, that Adrian's consistent approval of Eleanor's decisions over 4 years constituted ongoing authorization, that the retroactive formalization simply made explicit what had always been implicit. Duke Adrian trusted his wife to manage their estate, Edward said. He approved her decisions, benefited from her work, and never once questioned her authority to act on his behalf. That trust and approval constitute authorization in every meaningful sense. The formalization they've now completed simply documents what was always true. It was competent, it was logical. It felt completely inadequate against Blackwell's sharp clarity. Then the testimony began. Blackwell called his witnesses first, estate managers and legal experts who testified about proper authorization procedures, about the importance of explicit written permission, about the risks of informal arrangements. It was dry, technical, and devastatingly effective. When they broke for lunch, Eleanor felt like the case was slipping away. "We need something stronger," she said to Edwards during the recess. "All our arguments are defensive. We're trying to justify what I did instead of making the positive case for why it was right." "What positive case?" Edwards looked confused. "The law doesn't care whether your management was good. It cares whether it was properly authorized." "Then we make the law care," Eleanor said. "We show that rigid adherence to authorization rules would have destroyed Thornfield. We make the consequences of invalidating my work so clear that the court has to consider them." Edwards looked doubtful, but when court resumed, he shifted his approach. Instead of focusing on legal technicalities, he called witnesses to testify about Thornfield's condition before Eleanor's involvement and its condition now. The estate's banker testified about the debt restructuring Eleanor had negotiated, how she'd turned impossible payment schedules into manageable ones, how she'd saved Thornfield from foreclosure. Without Duchess Vance's intervention, he stated clearly, the estate would have collapsed financially by late 1821. Her management preserved not just the Duke's assets, but the livelihoods of everyone employed on Thornfield lands. A neighboring merchant testified about Eleanor's contract negotiations, how she'd secured better prices for Thornfield's timber while maintaining fair terms for buyers. "She was the most competent negotiator I worked with," he said. "Her knowledge of market conditions and her attention to detail exceeded most male estate managers I've dealt with." Then Thomas took the stand, representing the tenant families. Blackwell tried to dismiss him immediately. "Your Honor, this witness is a laborer with obvious bias toward his employer. His testimony is self-serving." "This witness," Thornberry replied coolly, "is a tenant whose lease is among the contracts being challenged. He has direct knowledge of the agreements in question. I'll hear his testimony." Thomas was nervous at first, but his voice steadied as he spoke about the changes Eleanor had made. Lower rents, better maintenance, fairer dispute resolution. He described the cottage roof collapses that had been ignored before Eleanor took over, the repairs that had been completed within weeks once she started managing things directly. "Before the Duchess, we were just numbers in a ledger," Thomas said. "Complaints went nowhere, problems piled up. People left because conditions were so bad. After she took over, things got better. Not perfect. Your grace isn't magic, but better. Fair. Like someone actually cared whether we lived or died." Blackwell stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Thomas, isn't it true that you're testifying out of self-interest? That you want these contracts upheld because they benefit you personally?" "Of course I want them upheld," Thomas replied. "They're good contracts. Fair terms, clear language, actual protections. Why would I want to go back to the way things were?" "So you admit your testimony is biased?" "I admit I'm telling the truth about what happened. If that's bias, I'll own it." Blackwell tried another angle. "Did you know, when you negotiated your lease with Duchess Vance, that she might not have proper legal authorization?" "I knew she was the person running things," Thomas said. "Knew she understood the estate better than anyone. Didn't much care about legal technicalities. I cared about getting a fair deal, and she gave me one." "So you weren't concerned with proper legal procedure?" "I was concerned with feeding my family," Thomas shot back. "Legal procedure is something rich people worry about. I worried about whether my lease terms would let me survive the winter." Several people in this gallery laughed. Thornberry didn't quite smile, but something shifted in her expression. The testimony continued through the afternoon. More tenants, more merchants, more professionals who'd worked with Eleanor, each one adding to a picture of competent, careful, effective management. Then Adrian took the stand. Blackwell approached him with barely concealed contempt. "Duke Adrian, when your wife began managing your estate, did you give her explicit written authorization to do so?" No, Adrian admitted. Did you review the contracts she signed on your behalf? Not most of them, no. Did you participate in negotiations with tenants, merchants, or neighboring estates? Rarely, Blackwell looked at the judge. So by your own admission, your wife operated independently, without your oversight or explicit approval, for 4 years. She operated with my complete trust and implicit approval, Adrian corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Because it seems to me you simply abdicated your responsibilities and let your wife do whatever she wanted. I let my competent wife manage things she was better equipped to handle than I was, Adrian said. That's not abdication, that's intelligence. Or weakness, Blackwell suggested. Call it whatever makes you feel superior, Adrian replied, his voice hardening. I call it recognizing reality. My wife saved our estate while I was too proud and too foolish to help. Now I'm supporting her authority publicly because it's the right thing to do and because she's earned it. If that makes me weak in your eyes, I don't particularly care. Murmurs ran through the courtroom. This wasn't how dukes usually spoke, admitting failure, praising their wives, dismissing social judgment. Blackwell tried to recover. Your recent authorization document, wasn't that a desperate attempt to retroactively cover your wife's unauthorized actions? It was an attempt to formalize what should have been formal from the beginning, Adrian said, to protect her authority from exactly this kind of bad faith legal harassment. Bad faith, Blackwell's voice rose. My client has legitimate concerns about contracts that may have been improperly executed. Your client, Adrian interrupted, is trying to steal our land and failing, so now he's trying to destroy my wife's reputation instead. Let's not pretend this is about legal principle. This is about a powerful man punishing a woman for being better than him. Your Honor! Blackwell looked scandalized, but Thornberry was watching Adrian with interest. Continue, Duke Adrian. Lord Pembroke tried to seize the Northern Valley based on fraudulent documents and stolen intelligence, Adrian said, speaking directly to the judge now. My wife defeated him soundly. Now he's using the legal system to attack her competence and her authority. If these contracts are invalidated, it sets a precedent that any woman's work can be erased if a man decides her authorization wasn't formal enough. That's not justice. That's weaponized prejudice. He turned to look at Pembroke. And I won't stand for it. My wife earned her authority through years of competent work. I'm documenting it now because society required me to, but the work was always real. The authority was always real. And no legal technicality is going to erase that. The courtroom was silent. Even Blackwell seemed momentarily at a loss. Thornberry called a recess. We'll resume tomorrow morning with closing arguments. Court is adjourned. Eleanor caught Adrian in the hallway outside the courtroom. That was, you just called Pembroke's lawsuit prejudice in open court. It is prejudice, Adrian said. Might as well name it. You're going to be crucified socially for that. I'm already being crucified. Might as well make it count. That night, they received word that 2 more estate holders had contacted their solicitor offering to testify. Both had worked with Eleanor. Both would support her competence. Ashford was right, Adrian said. People were just afraid to speak first, but once someone breaks ranks, others follow. Or Pembroke crushes them all and we lose anyway, Eleanor replied. Ever the optimist, ever the realist. The next morning brought closing arguments. Blackwell reiterated his legal case. Authorization must precede action. Informal approval doesn't satisfy legal requirements. The contracts must be voided. He was eloquent, logical, and completely ignored the human consequences of what he was arguing. Edwards presented the defense's closing argument. He focused on Thornfield's transformation, on the documented success of Eleanor's management, on the tenant families who would be harmed if the contracts were invalidated. He argued that rigid adherence to authorization formalities, when the authority had clearly existed in practice, would create injustice, not prevent it. Then Eleanor herself was allowed to make a statement. She stood before Justice Thornberry, aware of every eye in the courtroom on her. This was it. Her chance to speak for herself, to explain in her own words why her authority was real and should be recognized. Your Honor, I won't pretend I followed perfect legal procedure, Eleanor began. I didn't have written authorization for every contract I signed. I didn't involve my husband in every decision. I operated with more independence than society typically allows women. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I did that work because it needed to be done and no one else was doing it. Thornfield was failing. Tenants were suffering, debts were mounting, and my husband was not equipped to handle it. Through no fault of his own, he simply hadn't been trained in estate management the way I educated myself to be. Eleanor looked around the courtroom. So I made a choice. I could watch everything collapse while waiting for proper authorization that might never come. Or I could act, carefully, competently, with my husband's knowledge and trust, to save what I could. I chose action. And yes, I claimed authority that wasn't formally mine, because the alternative was letting people suffer while I worried about following procedures designed to exclude women like me from having any authority at all. She turned back to Thornberry. If you invalidate these contracts, you're not just erasing my work. You're telling every woman in a similar position that competence doesn't matter, that results don't matter, that only formal authorization, which women are systematically denied, creates legitimate authority. You're saying that it's better to follow procedures and fail than to bend rules and succeed. Eleanor's voice strengthened. I'm asking you not to do that. I'm asking you to recognize that authority comes from competent work, from trust earned over time, from results that speak for themselves. My husband has now formalized my authority because society required it. But that authority was real long before we put it on paper. And these contracts, negotiated in good faith, executed competently, beneficial to all parties, are valid regardless of whether I checked every bureaucratic box while creating them. She sat down, heart pounding. She'd said what she needed to say. Now it was up to Thornberry. The judge reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke. This case raises important questions about authority, authorization, and the intersection of legal formality with practical reality. I've heard testimony about Duchess Vance's competence, about the benefits of her management, and about the contracts in dispute. I've also heard arguments about proper legal procedure and the requirements for valid authorization. Thornberry looked directly at Eleanor. The law is clear that a wife cannot bind her husband's estate without his permission. What's less clear is what constitutes permission in practice. Lord Pembroke's suit argues that explicit written authorization is required. The defense argues that Duke Adrian's ongoing trust and approval constituted authorization, now formalized in writing. She paused. I'm inclined to agree with the defense. Eleanor felt something release in her chest. The evidence shows that Duke Adrian was aware of his wife's management activities, approved of them, and benefited from them over a period of 4 years, Thornberry continued. His recent formalization of her authority documents what was already functionally true. While more explicit authorization earlier would have been preferable, the absence of formality does not invalidate work that was clearly conducted with the title holder's knowledge and consent. Blackwell started to stand, but Thornberry held up a hand. Furthermore, the testimony from tenants, merchants, and other estate holders demonstrates that Duchess Vance's work was not only authorized but competent and beneficial. To void these contracts would harm innocent parties who negotiated in good faith with someone who clearly had practical authority to represent Thornfield's interests. The law should not create injustice by privileging formality over substance. Thornberry looked at Pembroke. Lord Pembroke's challenges to the disputed contracts are denied. The contracts stand as valid and enforceable. Duke Adrian's formal authorization of his wife's authority is recognized as documenting pre-existing practical authority rather than creating new authority. The suit is dismissed. The courtroom erupted, people talking, gasping, some shouting. Pembroke's face had gone dark red. Blackwell was already gathering papers, preparing appeals. But Eleanor barely heard the chaos. She'd won. The contracts were valid. Her authority was recognized. Adrian grabbed her hand, squeezed tight. "We did it! We did it!" Eleanor repeated, still not quite believing it. Edwards was beaming. "This is a landmark ruling. Thornberry just set precedent that practical authority can be formalized retroactively. This will matter beyond just your case, Your Grace." Outside the courtroom, tenants and supporters crowded around them. Thomas was actually crying. Mrs. Carter hugged Eleanor so hard she could barely breathe. Other estate holders who testified approached to offer congratulations and, surprisingly, requests for advice about their own management situations. Lord Ashford clasped Adrian's hand. "Well done, both of you. You stood up to Pembroke and won. That takes courage." "We had help," Adrian replied. "A lot of help. That's what happens when you earn respect instead of demanding it," Ashford said. Pembroke himself left quickly, surrounded by his legal team and associates. He didn't look at Eleanor, didn't acknowledge the loss, but his rigid posture and quick exit spoke volumes. As they rode back to Thornfield, Eleanor felt exhaustion mixing with elation. They'd won the battle. The contracts were safe, her authority was recognized, and Pembroke's challenge had failed. But she knew this wasn't over. Pembroke would appeal, would find new ways to attack them, would make their lives difficult for years. The social consequences would continue. Some people would never accept a woman claiming real authority, regardless of what courts said. Still, as they crested the hill overlooking Thornfield's lands, Eleanor felt something shift. The estate looked different somehow. Less like a burden she was protecting in secret, and more like a place she'd earned the right to lead openly. "We should celebrate," Adrian said. "Properly. Invite everyone who supported us. Thank them publicly." "That's a good idea," Eleanor agreed, "though my skill at planning parties is somewhat lacking." "Then we'll learn together," Adrian replied. "Seems to be our pattern these days." That evening, they stood in Eleanor's office, their office now, really, reviewing the judge's written decision. The language was careful but clear. Eleanor's authority was legitimate, her work was valid, and practical reality mattered as much as legal formality. "Thornberry took a risk with this ruling," Eleanor said. "She's going to face criticism for it." "Probably," Adrian agreed, "but she made the right call. Authority should come from competence, not just from checking procedural boxes." Eleanor looked at the authorization document, now validated by court ruling. Her name and Adrian's side by side. Co-equal authority, formally recognized. 4 years ago, she'd been invisible. 3 weeks ago, she'd been under attack. Now she was legally acknowledged as Thornfield's co-authority. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete victory. But it was real. "Thank you," she said quietly to Adrian, "for standing with me, for supporting my authority even when it cost you socially." "Thank you for saving us all when I was too blind to help," Adrian replied, "for doing the work I should have shared." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who'd started as strangers, become reluctant allies, and were slowly, painfully, awkwardly, building something like partnership. Outside, Thornfield settled into evening. Tenants in their cottages, workers finishing their tasks, the whole complex machinery of the estate continuing as it had for generations. But now, for the first time, Eleanor could operate openly, could sign contracts with her own name and have them stand unchallenged, could make decisions without hiding behind her husband's absent authority. The door was open. The truth was recognized, and Eleanor Vance had won the right to be visible. There would be more battles. Pembroke would regroup, society would continue judging, and the work of running an estate would never stop being difficult. But tonight, Eleanor stood in her office with legal validation in her hands and her husband beside her, and she let herself feel something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Hope lasted exactly 4 days before Pembroke proved it was premature. The attack came through channels Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Not legal challenges this time. Those had failed. Not social pressure. They'd weathered the worst of that. Instead, Pembroke went after Thornfield's economic foundations. Henderson brought the news during breakfast. "Your Grace, we've got a problem. 3 of our largest buyers just canceled their contracts for next season's timber, all of them citing market uncertainties." Eleanor set down her coffee. "Which buyers?" "Marchmont Mills, Davidson Brothers, and the Coastal Shipping Consortium. Together they account for nearly 40% of our timber revenue." "Let me guess," Adrian said. "They all have business relationships with Pembroke. Marchmont does directly. The other 2 have relationships with estates that owe Pembroke favors." Henderson looked grim. "This is coordinated. He's using economic pressure to strangle us." Eleanor was already calculating. Losing 40% of timber revenue would hurt, but wouldn't destroy them. She'd built enough financial cushion over the years to absorb the hit. But if other buyers followed, if the cancellation spread to other products, if Pembroke managed to isolate Thornfield economically, "What about our other contracts?" she asked. "Still solid for now. But Your Grace, if word spreads that major buyers are pulling out, others might panic. Nobody wants to be left holding contracts with an estate that might collapse." "We're not going to collapse," Eleanor said firmly. "We've weathered worse than this." "Have we, though?" Henderson's voice was unusually sharp. "Begging your pardon, but the legal victory was 3 days ago. The celebration's barely finished, and already Pembroke's hitting back harder than before. How long can we sustain this level of conflict?" It was a fair question, one Eleanor had been avoiding asking herself. "As long as it takes," she said. "Find alternative buyers for the timber. Expand our geographic reach if necessary, and gather data on our financial position. I want to know exactly how long we can operate at reduced revenue before we start cutting into reserves." After Henderson left, Adrian moved to stand beside her at the window. He's right, about this being exhausting. We can't fight Pembroke forever. Then what do you suggest? Surrender? Go back to pretending I don't exist? No. But we need to shift strategy. Stop reacting to his attacks and start making our own moves. Eleanor turned to look at him. What kind of moves? The kind that make Pembroke's power base vulnerable. He's using his economic connections against us. What if we expose the fact that those connections are built on corruption and fraud? We have evidence of that? Some, Adrian said, from when you were investigating his attempt to seize the Northern Valley. You found discrepancies in his surveyor's work, payments that suggested bribery. What if we took that evidence public, made it clear that Pembroke's business practices are questionable? Eleanor considered. It was aggressive, potentially reckless. It would turn their defensive fight into open warfare. But Henderson was right. They couldn't sustain this level of conflict indefinitely on the defensive. We'd need more than the surveyor fraud, she said slowly. We'd need a pattern, evidence that Pembroke routinely uses corrupt practices to gain business advantages. Then let's find it. They spent the next week digging. Eleanor reached out to contacts she'd built over 4 years, estate managers, merchants, solicitors, quietly asking questions, gathering stories, piecing together a picture of how Pembroke actually operated. What emerged was damning. The surveyor fraud hadn't been an isolated incident. Pembroke had a pattern of using questionable legal tactics to gain advantages. He'd pressured smaller estates into unfavorable deals by threatening expensive lawsuits. He'd used his connections to block competitors from accessing certain markets. He'd even, according to one bitter former business partner, falsified documents to win a county contract. This is enough, Eleanor said, reviewing the compiled evidence. This is more than enough to damage his reputation severely. If we release it, Adrian pointed out, once we do this, there's no going back. Pembroke will come after us with everything he has. He's already doing that. It could get worse, much worse. Eleanor looked at the documents spread across her desk. This was the nuclear option, the choice to stop defending and start destroying. It went against every instinct she'd developed. She'd built Thornfield through careful relationship management, through being trustworthy and reliable. Publicly attacking another lord's business practices, even with evidence, would change how people saw her. But Pembroke had left her no choice. He was systematically trying to starve Thornfield economically, and he wouldn't stop until they were ruined. Do it, she said. Compile the evidence into a formal report. Send copies to every major estate holder in the region, to the county magistrate, to the business consortium Pembroke belongs to. Make it public and make it thorough. Eleanor, I know the risks, she interrupted. I know this makes me look vindictive and aggressive. I know it violates social norms about how ladies should behave. But I'm done playing by rules that were designed to keep me powerless. If Pembroke wants war, we'll give him war. The report was released 5 days later. 20 pages of documented evidence showing a pattern of corrupt business practices spanning a decade. Names, dates, specific incidents, all carefully sourced and verified. The response was immediate and explosive. Some estate holders dismissed it as slander from a desperate woman. Others took it seriously and began their own investigations into business dealings with Pembroke. The business consortium launched a formal inquiry. The county magistrate requested Pembroke appear for questioning, and Pembroke himself arrived at Thornfield 3 days later, looking murderous. Eleanor received him in the formal drawing room, Adrian beside her. Thomas and several estate workers stood nearby, not threatening, but present. After the incident with Peter Jennings, no one was taking chances with potentially violent confrontations. "You've destroyed me," Pembroke said without preamble. His usual polish was gone, replaced by raw fury. "That report, those lies, everything in that report is documented and verifiable," Eleanor interrupted. "You're welcome to provide evidence contradicting any of it." "You think you're clever, don't you? Think you've beaten me?" Pembroke's voice rose. "All you've done is prove what I've been saying all along, that you're dangerous, vindictive, unfit for authority. No real lady would launch this kind of attack. No real gentleman would try to economically destroy someone for beating him in court," Eleanor replied coolly. "You started this fight, Lord Pembroke. You tried to steal our land, challenged our contracts, spread lies about my competence, and coordinated economic warfare against us. The report is simply documentation of the truth. It's slander, malicious destruction of my reputation based on twisted interpretations of legitimate business practices. Then defend yourself in court," Adrian said. "Sue us for slander. We'll present our evidence, you'll present yours, and we'll see who the court believes." Pembroke's hands clenched. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually become violent, But he seemed to realize the workers were watching, that any physical aggression would only make things worse for him. "You haven't won," he said, voice dropping to something more controlled but no less venomous. "This report might damage me, but it's destroyed you socially. Every decent family in the county will cut you off. You'll be pariahs. Your estate will wither because no one will work with you. Or," Eleanor said quietly, "people will see that we documented real corruption and respect us for having the courage to expose it. We'll find out which, I suppose." Pembroke turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I underestimated you, Duchess. I thought you were just an ambitious woman playing at authority. I see now you're something worse. You're willing to destroy anything and anyone to get what you want. That makes you dangerous in ways I didn't anticipate." "Good," Eleanor said. "Stay afraid of me. It'll make you more careful." After he left, Eleanor felt her knees go weak. She sat down heavily, hands shaking. "That was terrifying," she admitted. "That was necessary," Adrian corrected, "and you handled it perfectly." "Did I? Because I feel like I just made the worst enemy possible." "You already had the worst enemy possible. You just stopped pretending otherwise." The aftermath was chaotic. Some estate holders applauded Eleanor's courage in exposing corruption. Others condemned her for violating social norms about how conflicts should be handled. The County Business Consortium suspended Pembroke's membership pending investigation. 3 of his business partners quietly ended their relationships with him, but Thornfield also faced consequences. 2 more contracts were canceled, though whether from fear of association or genuine economic concerns was unclear. Several social invitations were withdrawn, and the whisper campaign intensified. Now Eleanor was not just unnatural, but vindictive. Not just ambitious, but ruthless. She tried not to care. Tried to focus on the work that needed doing, the estate that needed managing. But the isolation wore on her. Even Adrian, who'd stood by her throughout, sometimes looked exhausted by the constant social warfare. The turning point came from an unexpected source, Sarah Jennings. Sarah had been living quietly in a cottage on the estate since Peter's arrest, working in the kitchens and slowly rebuilding her life. She kept to herself mostly, still processing trauma, still figuring out how to exist without violence hanging over her. She appeared at Eleanor's office one afternoon, looking nervous but determined. "Your Grace, I heard what people are saying about you, about the report on Lord Pembroke, about you being vindictive and aggressive." "I'm sure you heard a lot of things," Eleanor said carefully. "I did, and I wanted to say," Sarah took a breath, "you're not vindictive. You're brave. When everyone else ignored what Peter was doing to me, you tried to help. When it went wrong, you still protected me and my children, and now you're fighting someone who's trying to destroy you, and people are calling that wrong somehow. That's not right." "Sarah, you don't need to—" "I want to," Sarah interrupted. "I want to tell people what you did for me, how you stood up to a dangerous man when everyone else looked away. I'm not important or influential, but I can still speak, and I will, if you'll let me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "That could bring you attention you don't want. People might question you, might dig into your past, might judge me for my husband's violence. They already do that." Sarah's voice was stronger now. "But maybe if I speak about what real courage looks like, some of them will listen. Maybe some other woman suffering what I suffered will see that there are people who fight for what's right, even when it's hard." Over the next week, Sarah did exactly that. She spoke at the market, at church gatherings, to anyone who would listen. She told her story plainly, the years of abuse, Eleanor's attempts to help, the morning Peter had held them hostage, and she made it clear that Eleanor's actions, however unconventional, had saved her life and her children's lives. Other women started speaking up too. Tenant wives who'd received help from Eleanor, workers whose families had been supported during hard times, even a few estate holders' wives who'd quietly watched Eleanor's work and respected it, even if they couldn't say so publicly before. It started small. A few voices defending Eleanor in conversations, pushing back against the narrative that she was dangerous or vindictive. But those voices multiplied. Women especially, women who'd lived their own versions of invisibility, who'd watched competent work dismissed or erased, who'd chafed against rules designed to keep them powerless. Lady Ashford, the wife of the estate holder who'd testified for Eleanor, hosted a gathering specifically to discuss women's contributions to estate management. She invited Eleanor as the guest of honor. 20 women attended, far more than expected. They talked openly about the work they did behind the scenes, the decisions they influenced, the knowledge they possessed that their husbands often took credit for. "You're not alone in this," Lady Ashford said to Eleanor during the gathering. Most of us have been doing versions of what you did, managing things quietly while men get the credit. You're just the first one brave enough to claim that work openly. Or foolish enough, Eleanor replied. Maybe both, Lady Ashford agreed, but it needed doing, and watching you fight for recognition is making some of us braver. The women's support didn't erase the criticism, but it shifted the narrative. Eleanor wasn't just an aggressive, unnatural woman anymore. She was someone fighting a battle many women recognized as their own. 6 weeks after the court victory, the County Business Consortium completed its investigation into Pembroke's practices. Their report was devastating. While they couldn't prove all the allegations in Eleanor's document, they found enough questionable conduct to recommend Pembroke's permanent expulsion from the consortium and referral for legal investigation. Pembroke fought back, of course, hired expensive lawyers, called in favors, tried to paint the investigation as biased, but the evidence was too solid. Too many people had been quietly resentful of his practices for too long. Eleanor's report had simply given them cover to speak up. 2 months after the court victory, Pembroke sold his largest estate and moved to the capital. Not a complete defeat. He still had wealth and some influence. But his dominance in the region was broken. He'd overreached, underestimated his opponent, and lost. Eleanor felt no triumph when she heard the news, just exhaustion and a kind of hollow relief. "It's over," Adrian said when they learned of Pembroke's departure. "We won." "Did we?" Eleanor asked. "We've lost contracts, friendships, social standing. We've made enemies who'll hate us for years. We've survived, but I'm not sure we've won." "We're still here," Adrian pointed out. "Thornfield still stands. You still have legal authority. We outlasted someone with more power and resources. If that's not winning, what is?" Eleanor looked around her office, their office. Maps on the walls showing every acre of Thornfield. Ledgers documenting years of careful management. Letters from tenants, from merchants, from the women who'd started speaking up in her defense. "I suppose you're right," she said. "Though it doesn't feel like the victories in stories. No dramatic triumph, just endurance." "Most real victories are like that," Adrian replied. "They're not about perfect moments. They're about still being standing when the dust settles." Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed Thornfield. Fields that had been brown and dormant burst into green. Repair projects that had been delayed through winter resumed. The estate woke up with an energy Eleanor hadn't felt in months. She walked the lands with Adrian one morning, reviewing progress on various projects. The boundary fence that had caused such trouble was being rebuilt properly now. The eastern cottages all had sound roofs. Sarah Jennings' cottage had been refurbished, and her children were attending the school Eleanor had helped establish in the nearest town. "It looks different," Adrian said, surveying the fields. "Or maybe I'm seeing it differently now." "Both, probably." Eleanor paused at the crest of a hill overlooking the main house. "I've spent 4 years protecting this place in secret, then months fighting to be allowed to protect it openly. And now I can just do the work. Without hiding, without fighting for permission, without constantly defending my right to care about it. How does that feel? Strange. Good strange, but strange." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm not allowed. For Pembroke to show up with another lawsuit, or for society to find a new way to punish me, or for something to go catastrophically wrong." "Things might still go wrong," Adrian said. "This isn't a perfect ending. We still have critics, still have challenges, still have work that's difficult and sometimes thankless." "I know, but we also have something we didn't have before. Partnership. Recognition. The right to operate openly." Eleanor looked at him. This man she'd married without love, learned to respect through crisis, and was slowly building something real with. Not romance exactly, though maybe that would come eventually. But trust. Genuine trust born from fighting together, failing together, surviving together. "When did you get wise?" she asked. "When I stopped pretending I already was," Adrian replied. "Somewhere around the time my wife demolished my comfortable illusions and forced me to see reality." They walked back to the main house together, discussing the 1,000 small details that made up estate management, crop rotations and fence repairs, tenant disputes, and merchant negotiations. The ordinary, essential work that Eleanor had done alone for so long and could finally share. That evening, they hosted a dinner for everyone who'd supported them through the conflict. Not a grand social affair, Eleanor's tolerance for those had always been limited, but a genuine gathering of allies, tenant representatives, neighboring estate holders who'd testified, the women who'd spoken up, even Justice Thornberry, who'd made a special trip to attend. Thomas gave a toast that was simultaneously heartfelt and embarrassing. To the Duchess, who actually gives a damn, and the Duke who learned to. May they keep Thornfield from falling apart and the rest of us from starving. Laughter and applause. Eleanor felt her face heat, but also felt something warm settle in her chest. These people, complicated, imperfect, sometimes difficult people, had chosen to stand with her when it cost them. That mattered more than social acceptance from people who valued propriety over justice. Later, when the guests had left and the house had settled into quiet, Eleanor sat in her office, reviewing the next day's schedule. Adrian appeared in the doorway, looking comfortable in a way he never had in the first years of their marriage. "I found something you should see," he said, holding out a letter. Eleanor took it, recognizing the seal. Lord Ashford. She read quickly, then looked up in surprise. "He's recommending me for the County Planning Commission? Apparently your work on boundary disputes and land management has impressed him. He thinks you'd be valuable on the commission that makes decisions about regional development." That's unprecedented. Women don't serve on planning commissions. Women didn't publicly claim authority over major estates until you did it, Adrian pointed out. Precedents are there to be broken. Eleanor read the letter again, feeling something shift in her understanding of what was possible. The County Planning Commission dealt with decisions affecting the entire region. Serving on it would give her influence beyond Thornfield, a voice in shaping policy and development. It would also make her even more visible, even more of a target for people who believed women shouldn't have such authority. "What do you think?" Adrian asked. Eleanor set down the letter, considering. 6 months ago, she would have declined automatically. Too risky, too visible, too likely to trigger backlash. But 6 months ago, she'd still been trying to operate from the shadows, still hoping to avoid direct conflict. Now? Now she'd survived the worst people could throw at her and was still standing. Now she had proof that she could fight publicly and win. Now she had allies who'd support her not despite her gender, but because of her competence. "I think," she said slowly, "I should accept. Carefully, with full awareness of the fight it'll cause, but accept." "Good," Adrian said, "because I already drafted your acceptance letter. I was just waiting for you to agree." Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, deep and genuine. "Presumptuous of you. I learned from the best." A year after the morning Eleanor had first exposed Adrian's ignorance and her own invisible authority, she stood in the county hall being sworn in as the first woman member of the Regional Planning Commission. The ceremony was controversial enough that protesters gathered outside, but inside, alongside the critics, were supporters. Women who'd watched her fight and been inspired. Men who'd seen her competence and respected it. People who believed authority should come from ability, not just from tradition. Sarah Jennings attended, sitting in the back with her children. Thomas represented the tenant families, looking uncomfortable in formal clothes but fiercely proud. Lady Ashford and several other estate holders' wives sat together, a visible statement of support. Adrian stood beside Eleanor as she took the oath, his presence a statement in itself. He'd transformed from an absent, ignorant duke to a genuine partner. Not perfect. He still made mistakes, still sometimes defaulted to old assumptions. But he tried. He learned. He chose growth over comfort. After the ceremony, as they left the hall through a crowd of mixed reactions, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in a window. She looked different than she had a year ago. Not just older or more tired, though she was both. She looked solid, real, visible in a way that couldn't be erased. Back at Thornfield that evening, standing at the window of the office that was no longer a secret workspace, but an acknowledged center of authority, Eleanor thought about the journey from invisibility to recognition. It hadn't been smooth or easy. It had cost her socially, emotionally, physically. There had been moments when she'd wanted to give up, to go back to hiding, to let someone else carry the weight. But she'd chosen visibility instead, had claimed her work openly, fought for recognition, endured the consequences. And in doing so, had changed not just her own life, but potentially the lives of other women watching her fight. The office door stood open as it had since that spring morning when everything changed. Workers passed freely, bringing questions and problems to be solved. Adrian worked at the second desk he'd installed, reviewing contracts and learning estate management with genuine dedication. Mrs. Chen appeared with tea, placed it on Eleanor's desk with a small nod of respect that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Outside, Thornfield's land stretched into darkness. Every acre familiar, every tenant family known to her. She'd spent 4 years protecting this place in secret. Now she protected it openly, with legal authority and public recognition. It wasn't perfect. Peter Jennings' children still carried trauma from their father's violence. Pembroke's economic attacks had left lasting damage to some contracts. Social critics still whispered about the unnatural Duchess and her weak husband. The work remained difficult, the challenges never ending. But Eleanor had something she hadn't had before: the right to exist fully. To claim her work, use her name, wield her authority without hiding or apologizing. She'd fought for visibility and won. Not a perfect victory, not a clean ending, but real, lasting. Hers, Côte. Adrian appeared beside her at the window, following her gaze across the darkened estate. "What are you thinking about?" "That we survived," Eleanor said. "That Thornfield survived. That maybe we proved something worth proving." "What's that?" "That competence matters more than gender. That authority comes from work, not just from titles or tradition. That women can fight for recognition and win, even when the system is designed to keep them invisible." "You proved that," Adrian corrected. "I just learned to get out of your way and then support you." "That was crucial too," Eleanor said. "None of this would have worked if you'd kept fighting me. The fact that you chose partnership over pride made the difference." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by obligation and had forged something genuine through crisis and conflict. Not a fairy tale romance, but something perhaps more valuable. A partnership built on respect, trust, and shared purpose. A knock interrupted the moment. Henderson appeared, looking apologetic. "Your Grace, there's a situation with the western boundary markers. The surveyor says there's a discrepancy with Lord Hartwell's land." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Of course there is. Send him to my office in 10 minutes. I'll review the maps." After Henderson left, Adrian squeezed her shoulder. "Never boring, is it?" "Never," Eleanor agreed. "But at least now I can handle it openly, with my name on the decisions and my authority recognized." She moved to her desk, already pulling out the relevant survey maps, her mind shifting into the problem-solving mode that had sustained Thornfield for years. The work continued, as it always would, but now she did it in the light, with acknowledgement and legal backing. The office door remained open. Staff came and went freely. Eleanor's name appeared on documents alongside Adrian's, both signatures carrying equal weight. The estate functioned not through the fiction of a competent duke, but through the reality of a partnership between two imperfect people who'd learned to work together. Outside, spring darkness settled over Thornfield. In the cottages, families slept safely, their leases solid, their roofs repaired, their lives protected by someone who'd chosen to be visible rather than safe. In the fields, crops grew under careful management. In the workshops, projects continued that would make next year better than this one. And in the center of it all, Eleanor Vance worked openly at her desk, solving problems, making decisions, wielding authority she'd earned through years of invisible labor and months of very visible fighting. She was no longer the Duchess who never was. She was simply the Duchess, recognized, acknowledged, real. The truth had cost her dearly, but it had also freed her completely. And in that freedom, Eleanor discovered something she'd never quite believed possible: the space to simply do her work, claim her competence, and exist fully as the person she'd always been but had never been allowed to be. The office door stood open, the ledgers bore her signature, the estate thrived under her acknowledged authority, and Eleanor Vance, Duchess of Thornfield, finally visible after years in shadow, turned her attention to the next problem that needed solving, because the work never ended. But now, at last, she could do it in the light.